In the winter of 537, the greatest city in the ancient world was defended by a mathematical impossibility. Rome, with its 12 miles of crumbling walls and 14 massive gates, required at least 30,000 men to mount even a basic defense. Flavius Belisarius had exactly 5,000. Outside those walls, the Gothic king Vitiges commanded 150,000 warriors equipped with siege towers that scraped the sky, catapults that could shatter marble, and the absolute certainty that no force so small could possibly hold a city so vast. They were wrong. For 1 year and 9 days, through a combination of tactical genius, psychological warfare, and sheer audacious brilliance, Belisarius held Rome against odds that would have sent Caesar himself fleeing. He turned shopkeepers into arbalists, convinced Goths that his cavalry could be in 3 places at once, and engineered counter-siege weapons so devastating that enemy soldiers believed he commanded demons. When the Goths finally withdrew, they left not because they had been defeated in battle, but because one man had made victory logically impossible. This is the story of that man, the last great Roman general who reconquered half the Mediterranean with armies that never exceeded the population of a small town, who served an emperor who feared him more than any enemy, and who achieved the impossible so routinely that his contemporaries accused him of sorcery. Belisarius was thrust into history at the precise moment when the ancient world was dying and the medieval age was being born. And for one magnificent generation, he nearly reversed the collapse of Western civilization through pure military genius. He took Carthage with 7,500 men. He conquered Italy with even less. He defeated Persian armies 5 times his size and saved Constantinople from the Huns when he was half-blind and commanding civilians. Yet he died in obscurity, stripped of his wealth, possibly begging for bread in the streets of the city he had enriched with the treasures of conquered kingdoms. His is a tale of triumph and betrayal that surpasses fiction. Because in fiction, the hero who saves the empire usually gets to keep his fortune, his reputation, and his eyes. The empire's edge was no place for a child, but the empire's edge was where Flavius Belisarius learned the first lesson of warfare. Speed kills. In 505 AD, when he was barely 5 years old, Bulgar raiders swept through his family's estate near Germania in Thrace, moving so fast that the local militia found only cooling ashes and counted their dead by the skulls scattered in burnt wheat fields. His father, a middle-ranking cavalry officer in the Limitani, the frontier forces that held the line between civilization and chaos, lifted young Belisarius onto his horse that day to survey the devastation. "Look carefully," his father said in the rough Latin of the frontier legions. "This is what happens when you're too slow." The boy looked. The blackened timbers of a neighboring villa still smoked. A child's wooden toy lay in the mud, its owner vanished into slavery beyond the Danube. Belisarius never forgot the lesson, and 20 years later, his enemies would learn what it meant when a Roman general decided to move faster than anyone thought possible. Thrace, in the early 6th century, was a cultural avalanche where languages collided and identities blurred. At the family table, Belisarius's father spoke Latin like a Roman of old. His mother answered in Greek like a proper Byzantine, and the Germanic farmhands muttered in Gothic when they thought no one was listening. The boy absorbed them all with the sponge-like capacity of youth, not knowing that this linguistic arsenal would one day let him interrogate Persian prisoners without translators, negotiate with Gothic kings in their own tongue, and decode enemy communications that his own staff couldn't read. His education was equally schizophrenic, mornings spent with a Greek pedagogue, learning Homer and Thucydides, afternoons in the stable yards where veteran soldiers taught him 20 different ways to kill a man with a spatha. The theologians in Constantinople were debating whether Christ had one nature or two. On the Thracian frontier, young officers learned that survival had only one nature: brutal, The transformation from frontier, nobody to imperial officer began with a Hun raid that went spectacularly wrong. For the Huns, in 520, Belisarius, now 20, and commanding a small cavalry unit, received intelligence that a Hun raiding party would strike the town of Adrianople during its harvest festival, when the walls would be lightly defended and the citizens drunk. Instead of rushing to defend the town with his 40 men, a futile gesture against 200 Hun cavalry, Belisarius did something unprecedented. He calculated the raiders' return route, identified a narrow valley they would have to traverse while laden with plunder, and positioned his men in 3 groups along the ridgeline. When the Huns entered the killing field, slowed by captives and loot, Belisarius's first group struck their vanguard with arrows, then vanished. As the Huns reorganized, the second group hit their flanks. When they wheeled to pursue, the third group crashed into their rear. The Huns, masters of mobile warfare, found themselves being outmaneuvered by a force 1/5 their size. They abandoned their plunder and fled, but not before Belisarius had personally killed their chieftain in single combat, a detail he made sure reached Constantinople. The report that landed on Emperor Justin's desk was brief but extraordinary. A 20-year-old officer with 40 men had routed 200 Huns and recovered 3,000 pounds of gold in stolen property. More importantly, the young officer's after-action report displayed a mathematical precision in describing troop movements, time calculations, and geometric angles of attack that suggested something beyond mere frontier cleverness. Justin, an old soldier who had risen from peasant to purple through military skill, recognized genius when he saw it. But it was Justin's nephew, reading over the emperor's shoulder, who saw something more. Justinian, still years from the throne, but already the power behind it, noticed that this frontier officer had ended his report with a quote from Vegetius's De Re Militari, in perfect Latin, with a Greek postscript discussing how the ancient author's principles applied to modern heavy cavalry. Here was no mere soldier, but a thinking man's warrior. The summons to Constantinople came in spring 521, delivered by an imperial courier whose purple-sealed orders were brief. Report to the palace. Come armed. Belisarius rode south with 6 men, crossing from the wild borderlands into the increasingly civilized provinces, passing from a world where Rome was a fading memory to one where it claimed to live eternal. As he approached the capital, the golden domes of the new Rome rose from the Bosphorus like a fever dream of marble and light. Constantinople in 521 was the greatest city on earth, home to 500,000 souls, and wealth that beggared imagination. For a young man from Thrace, where a villa with glazed windows was considered luxurious, the capital must have seemed like another planet. The Maze, the main thoroughfare, stretched 4 miles, lined with colonnaded shops selling everything from Chinese silk to Indian pepper. Statues of ancient heroes stood at every intersection, bronze reminders of what Romans had once achieved and might achieve again. But Belisarius had little time for sightseeing. Within hours of arrival, he was ushered into the Daphne Palace, through corridors where the marble was so polished he could see his reflection, and where imperial guardsmen stood motionless in gold and armor that cost more than his father's entire estate. The audience chamber was calculated to overwhelm. Purple hangings, golden throne, the emperor elevated above mere mortals, while incense clouds suggested divine presence. Justin sat rigid in ceremonial robes, but it was the younger man standing beside the throne who commanded attention. Justinian was 39, with the soft body of a scholar and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything for future use. When Belisarius entered, performing the proskynesis, the full prostration required before the emperor, Justinian broke protocol to speak first. "Rise, soldier. We've read your report on the Hun engagement. Explain why you divided your force when Vegetius explicitly warns against it." It was a test, and Belisarius recognized it instantly. "Caesar divided his forces at Dyrrhachium," he replied, still on one knee but with his head raised. "Scipio Africanus divided his at Ilipa. Vegetius provides principles, not shackles. The Huns expected Roman doctrine, a shield wall, a static defense. I gave them chaos instead." Justinian smiled, the expression of a chess player who had just discovered a new piece. "And if they had stood and fought instead of fled?" Belisarius's answer would echo through his entire career. "Then I would have vanished into the forest and struck them again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Victory isn't about winning battles, Caesar." He used Justinian's formal title, though the man wasn't emperor yet. "It's about making defeat unbearable for your enemy." Within a week, Belisarius had been inducted into the Schola Palatinae, the elite palace guard, with a commission signed by Justin but clearly orchestrated by Justinian. His new commander, Citus, was another young officer who had caught Justinian's eye, and together they formed the core of what palace whispers called Justinian's Young Wolves. A new generation of military talent being groomed for something greater. The palace was a universe away from Thrace, a place where words could kill as surely as swords, and where the wrong theological opinion about Christ's nature could end a career faster than losing a battle. Belisarius navigated it by being exactly what he had always been, a soldier. When courtiers tried to draw him into palace intrigues, he spoke only of tactics. When theologians sought his opinion on the Monophysite controversy, he quoted scripture about rendering unto Caesar. It was perhaps his greatest tactical maneuver. In a court where everyone schemed, the man who refused to play politics became invaluable to all sides. The transformation was remarkable. The frontier cavalryman learned to read architectural plans so he could discuss siege warfare with engineers. He studied accounts of Hannibal's campaigns in the palace library, annotating them with observations about how elephants might be countered with modern Greek fire. He sparred with the palace guards, learning the formal swordplay of the capital while teaching them the dirty tricks of border warfare. And always, Justinian watched, mentally filing away every detail of his protégé's development. The future emperor saw in Belisarius what he needed most, a general brilliant enough to reconquer the lost West, but loyal enough never to claim it for himself. Whether that assessment would prove accurate would become the central drama of both their lives. Then came the morning that would change everything. It was late 522, a day that started like any other with Belisarius drilling guardsmen in the palace courtyard, when a woman's laugh cut through the clash of weapons. Not courtly titter or a modest giggle, but a full-throated laugh that suggested its owner didn't give a damn about imperial propriety. Belisarius turned to see a woman perhaps 10 years his senior, dressed in silk that cost more than a soldier's yearly pay, watching the sparring match with undisguised amusement. "You fight like you're afraid you'll scratch the palace marble," she called out. This was Antonina, friend of the Empress-to-be Theodora, former actress, current social climber, and future wife of Belisarius. Their meeting was either cosmic fate or careful calculation. With Antonina, it was always impossible to tell. She would bear him children, save his life through palace intrigue, betray him with other men, and remain by his side until death. But that morning, she was simply a woman who laughed at his cautious swordplay, and he was a young man suddenly aware that there were battles in Constantinople that had nothing to do with weapons. The stage was now set. A brilliant young general loyal to a fault, an ambitious emperor with impossible dreams, a cunning wife who understood the palace better than any battlefield, and looming before them all, the shattered remnants of Rome's Western Empire, waiting to see if anyone was bold enough, or foolish enough, to try to piece them back together. Belisarius was about to prove that he was both. The marriage proposal came wrapped in scandal and delivered by an empress-to-be who had once performed naked on Constantinople's stages. Theodora summoned Belisarius to her quarters in early 527 when Justin lay dying, and everyone knew Justinian would soon wear the purple. "My friend Antonina finds you interesting," Theodora said, without preamble, her voice still carrying traces of the streets, despite the imperial silk. "She's had 3 husbands. 1 died conveniently, 2 she discarded. She needs a 4th who won't bore her." Belisarius, who had faced Persian cavalry charges without flinching, found himself unnerved by this small, fierce woman who spoke of marriage like a military alliance. "I barely know her," he managed. Theodora's smile was predatory. "You know she has my ear. You know I will have the emperor's. What else matters?" It was the kind of mathematical equation Belisarius understood perfectly. Marry Antonina, gain Theodora's protection, survive the palace. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, a lavish affair that announced to Constantinople's elite that the Thracian soldier was now part of the inner circle. Antonina wore purple, a color technically forbidden to anyone but imperial family, a detail no one dared mention. The plague struck Justin's bowels in July 527, and by August, the old soldier emperor was dead. Justinian's coronation should have been triumphant. Instead, it felt like the prelude to catastrophe. The treasury was nearly empty from Justin's Persian wars. The blues and greens, the chariot racing factions that had evolved into political parties, criminal gangs, and religious militias, were murdering each other in the streets. The Senate muttered about this upstart who spoke Greek with a Balkan accent and had married a whore. But Justinian had vision, feverish, impossible, magnificent vision. The night after his coronation, he gathered his inner circle in the Delphax Palace, where emperors traditionally planned wars. The maps on the walls showed the empire's current borders. "Wrong maps," Justinian said, and had them replaced with ones from Trajan's time, when Rome ruled from Scotland to Sudan. "This is our empire. Some of it is temporarily occupied by barbarians. Belisarius will get it back." The room fell silent. Citus, now Magister Militum of Armenia, laughed nervously. "The entire West. We can barely hold Syria." But Belisarius was studying the maps with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "Africa first," he said quietly. "The Vandals have grown soft. A small, fast force could die gloriously," interrupted Narses, the emperor's cubicularius, a eunuch whose soft voice belied a mind sharp as any blade. "The last expedition against Carthage required 1,000 ships and 50,000 men. It failed catastrophically. This was the first real exchange between the 2 men who would define Byzantine military policy for the next 30 years. Belisarius with his battlefield genius, Narses with his logistical brilliance and unlimited ambition. They circled each other like wary predators, recognizing both an equal and a threat. But before any Western conquests could begin, Persia demanded attention. The Sassanid king, Kavath, had spent decades perfecting his army and now pressed against the eastern frontier like a slow avalanche. In 528, Justinian appointed Belisarius as Magister Militum per Orientem, commander of the East, making him, at 28, one of the youngest men ever to hold the position. Antonina accompanied him to Daras, the fortress city on the Persian frontier, bringing her personal household of 200 servants, her collection of Chinese silks, and her revolving door of lovers. A situation Belisarius either didn't notice or chose to ignore. "You're a fool," Citus told him one evening as they surveyed the Persian positions. "Everyone knows about Antonina and that adopted son of yours." Belisarius's response revealed either sublime wisdom or pathological denial. "I know what I need to know. She keeps Theodora happy. Theodora keeps Justinian from executing me for being too successful. The Persians are simpler enemies than palace eunuchs. The Battle of Daras in June 530 announced Belisarius to the world. 40,000 Persians, including their elite immortals, faced 25,000 Romans across a plain that offered no advantage to either side. Or so it seemed. The night before battle, Belisarius had his men dig a series of trenches in a pattern that looked random but was geometrically precise, calculated to channel Persian cavalry into killing zones. He placed his unreliable infantry in the center, his veteran cavalry on the wings, and his Hunnic mercenaries hidden behind hills. When the Persians attacked at dawn, their cavalry charged into the trenches and stumbled. The Roman center gave way as expected. Belisarius had ordered them to retreat, drawing the Persians into a trap. The wings collapsed inward, while the Huns appeared from nowhere, turning the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. By noon, 8,000 Persians lay dead. Roman losses, 700. The impossible had become routine. But in Constantinople, Justinian received the victory dispatch with mixed emotions. His general had won brilliantly, too brilliantly. Whispers reached the palace that soldiers were calling Belisarius the young Caesar, that Persian prisoners asked if he was Roman emperor. Justinian wrote back with congratulations wrapped in warnings. Remember that victory comes from God through his chosen emperor. The subtext was clear. Win battles, but never forget who rules. This dynamic, Justinian needing Belisarius's genius while fearing it, would poison every triumph that followed. Meanwhile, Narses began his own campaign. This one fought with whispers and gold, building a network of officers loyal to him rather than to the victorious general. The victory at Daras should have led to greater things, but the battle at Callinicum in 531 nearly ended everything. Belisarius, pressured by subordinates eager for loot, reluctantly engaged a Persian force on unfavorable ground during Easter week. His Arab allies betrayed him mid-battle. His infantry broke, and only desperate cavalry charges prevented total disaster. He saved most of his army through a fighting withdrawal that military historians still study, but in Constantinople, his enemies pounced. "The great general defeated," Narses whispered to anyone who would listen. Justinian recalled Belisarius for an inquiry, the kind that often ended with execution. But Belisarius had something his enemies didn't: Antonina, who spent a fortune in bribes and called in every favor Theodore owed her. The inquiry concluded that Belisarius had acted correctly, given his treacherous allies. He kept his head, but learned another lesson. In Justinian's court, a heroic defeat was safer than a spectacular victory. Then came January 532, and the world exploded. It started, as most disasters do, with bureaucratic stupidity. 2 men, one blue and one green, both condemned for murder, survived their hangings when the ropes broke. The crowd declared it a miracle and demanded pardons. Justinian refused. By January 13th, Constantinople was burning. The Nika riots, named for the victory chant that became a rebel war cry, represented the complete breakdown of imperial authority. Blues and greens united for the first time in history, proclaiming a new emperor, Hypatius, nephew of the former emperor Anastasius. The palace guard vanished. Senators fled to their estates. The entire government essentially ceased to exist, except for a handful of loyalists barricaded in the palace, listening to the mob burn the city their ancestors had built. Justinian prepared to flee. Ships waited in the harbor to carry the imperial couple to Carthage, ironically, still in Vandal hands. The crown jewels were already loaded. It was Theodora who changed history with perhaps the most famous speech never recorded verbatim but attested by every source. "Purple makes an excellent burial shroud," she allegedly concluded, declaring she would rather die an empress than live in exile. Whether from shame or inspiration, Justinian stayed. But staying meant fighting, and the palace guard had proven useless. Belisarius had 500 men, his personal bucellarii, household troops whose loyalty was to him alone. Narses had the palace eunuchs and, more importantly, bags of gold. Mundus, a Gepid prince turned Roman general, commanded a few hundred Herulian mercenaries who happened to be in the city. The plan was Belisarius's, simple and horrifying. The rebels, 30,000 strong, had packed into the Hippodrome for Hypatius's coronation. The arena had only a few exits, and the crowd, drunk on wine and revolution, had posted no guards. Narses went first, bribing the blue leaders to remember their hatred of the greens, sowing enough confusion to prevent unified action. Then Belisarius entered through the emperor's entrance, the Kathaisma, while Mundus came through the opposite gate. What followed wasn't a battle, but an abattoir. Packed civilians facing armored soldiers in a confined space had only one possible outcome. The bucellarii worked systematically, shields locked, swords rising and falling like a harvest of death. Some rebels tried to flee but found the gates barred from outside. Others climbed the seats, only to be shot down by archers. The killing took 6 hours. When the sun set on January 18th, 532, 30,000 Constantinopolitans lay dead in the Hippodrome. The sand meant for chariot races was now a swamp of blood, so deep that bodies literally floated. Hypatius, dragged from the imperial box where he had been proclaimed emperor hours earlier, begged Justinian for mercy, swearing he had been forced to accept the crown. Justinian, still shaking with rage and fear, had him executed that night. The blues and greens never again challenged imperial authority. The Senate, many of whom had hedged their bets during the riots, now prostrated themselves before an emperor who had proven he would rather rule a cemetery than surrender power, and Belisarius, covered in the blood of civilians, had bound himself forever to Justinian's regime. He was no longer just a general. He was the man who had saved the throne through mass murder. Antonina found him that night in the palace baths, trying to wash blood from under his fingernails. 30,000, he kept saying. She slapped him, hard. 30,000 rebels. Would you prefer they had burned the city, killed Justinian, killed us? She grabbed his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. You're not a philosopher. You're a sword. Swords don't have consciences. It was cruel, calculated, and exactly what he needed to hear. The next morning, Belisarius reported to Justinian as if nothing had happened, ready for orders. The emperor, sitting on a throne now secure thanks to mass murder, had already moved on to his next obsession. Africa. The Vandals have grown weak. Their king Gelimer is a fool. Take Africa for me, Belisarius. Prove that Roman armies can still conquer, not just slaughter. The commission was both reward and exile. Glory if he succeeded, convenient death if he failed. Either way, Justinian wouldn't have to see the man who had turned the Hippodrome into a slaughterhouse, who soldiers called the Emperor's Sword, with a mixture of awe and fear. As Belisarius prepared his expedition, recruiting troops and studying maps of lands no Roman had seen in decades, Constantinople rebuilt itself on the bones of the rioters. The Hagia Sophia, burned during Nika, would rise again as Justinian's architectural miracle. The laws would be codified into the Corpus Juris Civilis. The empire would be reborn through ambition, genius, and blood, so much blood. And at the speartip of this transformation stood Belisarius, the last Roman, about to attempt what everyone said was impossible, reconquering the lost West with an army smaller than what the rebels had fielded in the Hippodrome. The fleet sailed for Africa in June 533, 500 ships carrying 15,000 soldiers and the hopes of an empire. As Constantinople faded into the morning mist, Antonina stood beside her husband, already calculating which officers might betray them, which might be seduced. which might need to die. Africa, she mused. I hear the shopping in Carthage is excellent. Belisarius said nothing, studying the horizon where somewhere beyond the curve of the earth lay either immortal glory or anonymous death. Behind them, Justinian watched from the palace walls, already wondering if he had created his own Frankenstein, a general too brilliant to fail, too successful to trust, too necessary to destroy. At least not yet. The severed head of Kavad arrived in Constantinople wrapped in silk and preserved in honey, a gift from his son and successor, Khosrau the Barefar, who wanted Justinian to understand exactly what kind of man now ruled Persia. My father died in his bed, the accompanying letter read in flawless Greek, but I send you his head anyway, so you may look upon the face of the last Persian king who showed Rome mercy. It was September of 531, and while Justinian pondered this grotesque diplomatic overture, Belisarius was already preparing for war against an enemy who collected Roman skulls the way other monarchs collected art. Khosrau, whom history would call the immortal soul, was 25, brilliant and completely insane by Roman standards. He had executed his brothers, his uncles, and supposedly kept a chess set made from the finger bones of defeated generals. Against this philosopher monster, Justinian sent Belisarius back to the frontier with 17,000 men and impossible orders. Defend everything, lose nothing, spend no money. The fortress of Daras hadn't seen Belisarius for 6 months, but it had seen Khosrau's scouts every day, Persian cavalry who would ride within arrow range, count defenders, and vanish into the desert like mirages. The garrison commander, a walking wine jug named Bauses, greeted Belisarius with the cheerful news that half the wells had been poisoned, the granaries were infested with rats, and morale was so low that soldiers were deserting to the Persians just for regular meals. Also, Bauses added, there's a prophet in the ranks claiming you're the Antichrist because you killed Christians in the Hippodrome. Belisarius handled the prophet by promoting him to chaplain, the rats by importing 500 cats from Egypt, and the wells by having Antonina's personal physician, a Syrian Jew named Samuel who claimed he could cure death itself if paid enough, develop an antidote using charcoal and wine. Within 3 weeks, Daras was defensible. Within 6 weeks, it was a trap. The revolution Belisarius brought to warfare wasn't in the grand strategy. Romans had always understood that. It was in the details everyone else ignored. He calculated that a Persian horse carrying an armored rider could gallop at full speed for exactly 12 minutes before exhaustion. So he positioned his cavalry reserves precisely 12.5 minutes from where he predicted the Persian charge would climax. He discovered that Persian arrows, designed to penetrate Roman shields, flew in a predictable arc that could be mathematically plotted. So he trained his men to shift formation at exact moments, creating gaps where arrows would land harmlessly. Most importantly, he realized that Khosrau, for all his brutality, was essentially playing chess. Brilliant, logical, predictable chess. Belisarius decided to play dice instead. The morning of the Second Battle of Daras, June 532, began with Belisarius doing something so unexpected that Persian historians assumed it was sorcery. He retreated before the battle even started. His entire army pulled back from their fortified positions, abandoning trenches they had spent weeks digging, leaving behind what appeared to be their supply wagons. Khosrau, watching from his golden pavilion, suspected a trap but couldn't see it. His generals begged him to advance. The Romans were fleeing. The great king's honor demanded pursuit. After 3 hours of watching Belisarius retreat, Khosrau's patience snapped. 50,000 Persian cavalry charged after 15,000 retreating Romans, their battle cries shaking the desert. They reached the abandoned Roman camp, found the supply wagons, began looting, and discovered the wagons were filled with ceramic pots. Inside the pots was Greek fire. The explosion could be seen from Daraz's walls, 12 miles away. Thousands of Persians simply ceased to exist, transformed into carbon shadows on the sand. The survivors, blinded and deafened, stumbled into the second surprise. Belisarius's retreat had led them into a box canyon where his cavalry waited on 3 sides. The slaughter was so complete that Khosrau, watching his army evaporate, allegedly turned to his advisors and asked, "Is their general human or demon?" The answer came from a Persian prince named Xerxes, not his real name, but one Khosrau had given him to invoke past glory. "He's worse than a demon, Majesty. He's a mathematician." By sunset, Persian power on the frontier was broken. Khosrau sent envoys requesting a truce. Belisarius, covered in dust and blood, received them in a tent still smoking from Greek fire and spoke a single word: "No." But Justinian, receiving news of this overwhelming victory, immediately sent new orders: make peace. The emperor's reasoning was Byzantine in every sense. Victory too complete would provoke Khosrau to total war, would cost money the empire didn't have, and worst of all, would make Belisarius even more popular than the Hippodrome massacre had already made him. The peace treaty, signed in September 532, was called eternal and lasted exactly 8 years. Belisarius obeyed orders, as always, but his officers noticed him staring east toward Persian territory with the expression of a starving man looking at a feast he's been forbidden to eat. "We could have taken Ctesiphon," he told Antonina that night. She laughed, that same unrestrained laugh from their first meeting. "And then what? Crown yourself Shah? You'd look terrible in Persian makeup." The return to Constantinople should have been triumphant. Instead, it felt like attending his own funeral. The city celebrated him with parades that Justinian didn't attend. Senators praised him in speeches that somehow always mentioned the emperor twice as often. Even his rewards felt like threats. A palace on the Bosphorus that put him under constant imperial surveillance, a consulship that was purely honorary, gold that came with accountants to track every coin. But the strangest moment came during a private dinner when Theodora, drunk on unmixed wine, suddenly grabbed Belisarius's hand and hissed, "He fears you, you know. Every night, he dreams you're standing over his bed with a sword." Before Belisarius could respond, she laughed and turned to Antonina. "Your husband should grow a beard. He looks too young to be so dangerous." It was during this uncomfortable peace that Belisarius developed his African strategy, spending hours in the imperial library reading accounts of ancient Carthaginian wars. The librarians whispered that he never took notes, simply stared at maps until servants had to remind him to eat. What he was doing was calculating distances, supply needs, water sources, seasonal wind patterns. The Vandals had held Africa for a century. Their fleet commanded the Western Mediterranean, and conventional wisdom said reconquest would require 50,000 men minimum. Belisarius concluded he could do it with 15,000 if, and this was crucial, he moved so fast the Vandals wouldn't have time to think. Speed, always speed. The Huns had taught him that in Thrace when he was 5. Now he would teach it to the world. The expedition's preparation revealed Belisarius at his most brilliant and most paranoid. He personally selected every officer, choosing competence over connections, promoting Greeks, Syrians, even Goths if they could fight. This infuriated the traditional Roman military families, who complained to Justinian that the army was becoming barbarized. Justinian's response was perfect in its ambiguity. Then it will be a barbarian victory or a barbarian defeat. Either way, Romans won't be blamed. But Belisarius's real innovation was in logistics. He calculated that traditional supply lines across the Mediterranean would be impossible to maintain. So he hired Egyptian grain merchants to pre-position supplies along the African coast, paying them in advance with his own money when the imperial treasury delayed. He recruited Berber scouts who had fled Vandal oppression, promising them vengeance and gold. Most cleverly, he spread rumors that his force was heading for Sicily, even filing false supply requisitions for Sicilian ports. Antonina's role in the expedition caused the most controversy. She insisted on accompanying the fleet with her household of 400 servants, her mobile palace of silk tents, and most scandalously, her adopted son Theodosius, a young man of such spectacular beauty that sailors made bets on whether Belisarius was blind or simply stupid. The relationship between Antonina and Theodosius was barely concealed. They shared a tent, emerged together each morning, and she called him "my darling boy" in front of her husband. Yet Belisarius seemed genuinely oblivious, discussing tactics with Theodosius as if he were just another officer. His secretary, Procopius, who would later write both the official history glorifying Belisarius and the secret history damning everyone, recorded one extraordinary exchange. A subordinate asked Belisarius how he could tolerate such open humiliation. Belisarius replied, "When I'm planning battles, I don't think about bedchambers. When I'm in bedchambers, I don't think at all." The fleet finally sailed in late June 533, 500 ships carrying the hopes of Roman restoration. As they passed through the Hellespont, old men who remembered the last African expedition lined the shores, some cheering, others openly weeping, remembering the 100,000 men who had sailed this route and never returned. The omens were mixed. Dolphins followed the ships, good. But a sudden storm forced them to shelter in Greece, bad, where they discovered the water barrels had leaked and the hardtack was moldy, catastrophic. Any other general might have turned back. Belisarius used it as an opportunity, forcing an emergency landing in the Peloponnese where his quartermasters, certainly by coincidence, had pre-positioned fresh supplies. The disaster had been planned, a way to test his officers and remove those who panicked. But the real test came when they reached Sicily. A messenger waited with urgent news. Gelimer, the Vandal king, had sent his best general, Zazo, with 5,000 elite warriors to suppress a rebellion in Sardinia. The Vandal fleet was scattered across the Mediterranean. Carthage itself was defended by barely 10,000 men, most of them garrison troops who hadn't fought a real battle in decades. It was an opportunity so perfect that Belisarius's officers immediately suspected a trap. "It's too easy," argued John the Armenian, his cavalry commander. "Since when has God made anything easy for Rome?" Belisarius's answer would echo through history. God doesn't make things easy. He makes them possible. We make them easy by moving faster than our enemies believe we can move. The decision to sail directly for Africa, bypassing all intermediate stops, defied every principle of ancient naval warfare. Ships needed regular resupply, crews needed rest, and September storms could scatter a fleet beyond recovery. Belisarius didn't care. He ordered full sails, day and night sailing, and told his captains that any ship that couldn't keep pace should be abandoned. The gamble was insane, glorious, and perfectly calculated. 5 days later, the Roman fleet appeared off the African coast like a fever dream. Vandal scouts couldn't believe their eyes. The nearest Vandal army was 3 days away. The harbor defenses of Carthage were unmanned because it was the Vandal Sabbath. They were Arian Christians who took their rest day seriously. And Belisarius, standing on the prow of his flagship, looking at the shores of Africa that no Roman general had touched in a century, spoke the words that would define his entire career. "Fortune favors audacity. But audacity without preparation is suicide. We have prepared. Now we be audacious." Behind him, 15,000 men prepared to attempt the impossible. Ahead lay Carthage, the Vandal kingdom, and either glory or disaster. But at that moment, As the September sun turned the Mediterranean gold and the shores of Africa beckoned like destiny itself, even Procopius, the cynical secretary who trusted no one, wrote in his journal, "I looked upon Belisarius and thought, perhaps the old gods aren't dead. Perhaps they simply wear Christian faces now." The invasion of Africa was about to begin. The last Roman had come to reclaim Rome's oldest conquest, and somewhere in Constantinople, Justinian waited for news, praying for victory, but not too much victory, success, but not too much success. It was, after all, a very Byzantine way to wage war. The first Vandal to see the Roman invasion force was a tax collector named Goda, who had stopped to relieve himself behind a sand dune near Caput. He looked up from his business to see 500 ships materializing from the morning haze, like the fever dream of a dying man. He ran, still adjusting his trousers, toward his horse, fell face first into the sand, scrambled up, and rode toward Carthage, screaming about sea demons. By the time anyone believed him, Belisarius had already landed 4,000 men and was building a fortified camp with the efficiency of a machine. The date was September 3rd, 533, marked in Vandal chronicles as the day the world turned upside down. What those chronicles didn't record was that Belisarius spent his first hour on African soil violently ill, having discovered during the voyage that he suffered from devastating seasickness, a detail he had hidden by claiming he was fasting for spiritual clarity. The Vandals had ruled Africa for 100 years with the casual brutality of owners who never expected to face eviction. They had confiscated the best estates, enslaved the Roman population, and grown so comfortable that most had forgotten how to fight on foot. Vandal warriors literally couldn't walk long distances anymore, their legs atrophied from constant riding. King Gelimer, receiving news of the invasion at his palace in Carthage, refused to believe it at first. 15,000 men? To conquer a kingdom? He actually laughed, then ordered his guard to arrest the messenger for spreading panic. It took 3 more messengers, including his own brother Amatus, to convince him that Rome, dead, buried, forgotten Rome, had somehow returned from the grave. His response revealed why the Vandals would lose. Instead of immediately attacking the Roman beachhead when they were vulnerable, he spent 3 days writing letters to his scattered forces, planning an elaborate triple envelopment that would have made Hannibal proud. If only he had Hannibal's army instead of aristocrats who considered armor unfashionably heavy. Belisarius, meanwhile, turned the conquest into a hearts and minds campaign that modern counterinsurgency experts still study. His first order upon landing was death for any soldier who stole from locals, and he enforced it, hanging a Roman cavalryman who took fruit from an orchard without paying. Word spread through the African provinces like wildfire. The Romans were back, and they were paying retail. Farmers who had hidden their produce from Vandal tax collectors suddenly appeared at the Roman camp with wagons full of supplies. More importantly, the Arian Vandals had persecuted the Catholic majority for a century. Belisarius, though personally indifferent to theological disputes, made sure to attend Catholic Mass publicly, kiss the local bishop's ring, and declare that he came as the sword of Orthodox Christianity. Within a week, he had better intelligence on Vandal movements than Gelimer had on his. The Battle of Ad Decimum, the 10th milestone from Carthage, should have been a Roman catastrophe. Gelimer's plan was actually brilliant. His brother Amatus would attack from Carthage with 2,000 men. His nephew Gibamund would strike from the west with another 2,000, while Gelimer himself would crush the Roman rear with 7,000 elite cavalry. On September 13th, all 3 forces converged on Belisarius's army, strung out along 20 miles of road. For about an hour, it worked perfectly. Gibamund's force smashed into the Roman vanguard, scattering them. Amatus charged the Roman center, causing panic. Any normal general would have been destroyed, but Belisarius had anticipated this. Not the specific plan, but the Vandal tendency toward elaborate maneuvers. He had placed his best troops, his personal bucellari, at the rear, where military conventions said the weakest units should go. When Gelimer's elite cavalry came thundering over the hills, expecting to find supply wagons and camp followers, they found instead Belisarius himself, leading 500 armored killers who had been waiting in formation for exactly this moment. What followed was less a battle than a demonstration of why Belisarius was worth any 10,000 normal soldiers. He didn't just defeat Gelimer's charge, he choreographed its destruction like a dance master. His bucellari wheeled and struck in sequence, each unit attacking then withdrawing, pulling the Vandals apart like a child dissecting an insect. But the masterstroke came when Belisarius personally killed Gelimer's standard-bearer, then had one of his Huns, a warrior named Uliaris who could mimic any voice, shout orders in Gelimer's exact tone, telling the Vandals to retreat. In the dust and chaos, they obeyed. Gelimer, seeing his army fleeing on what he thought were his own orders, assumed treachery and fled as well. The elite of Vandal nobility, the descendants of warriors who had sacked Rome itself, ran from phantom betrayals and their own confused commands. But here's where Belisarius proved he was more than just a tactical genius. Instead of pursuing immediately orthodox military doctrine since Alexander, he stopped. He reformed his scattered units, counted his men, redistributed ammunition, and most importantly, sent riders ahead to spread the news. Gelimer has fled. The Vandals abandoned their king. By the time he advanced the next day, Carthage was already psychologically conquered. Amatus lay dead, killed in a skirmish so minor the Romans didn't even realize they had eliminated Gelimer's brother. The city's Vandal garrison, hearing that their king had abandoned them, abandoned the city in turn. The Catholic population threw open the gates. On September 15, 533, exactly 10 days after landing in Africa, Belisarius entered Carthage in triumph, his men singing psalms while the population pelted them with flowers instead of stones. The scene in Gelimer's palace that evening was surreal. Belisarius sat in the Vandal king's throne, eating the dinner that had been prepared for Gelimer, roast peacock with garum sauce, while the palace servants simply continued their duties as if changing masters was as routine as changing clothes. The royal treasury was intact. Gelimer had fled so quickly he hadn't even taken his crown. Belisarius immediately did two things that defined his character. He sent every piece of gold to Constantinople, keeping none for himself, to his officers' dismay, and issued orders that no Vandal property be confiscated without proof of it being originally stolen from Romans. "We are liberators, not conquerors," he told his men, who grumbled but obeyed because Belisarius had just done in 10 days what everyone said would take 10 years. Gelimer, hiding in the desert with remnants of his army, sent increasingly desperate letters to his brother Zazo in Sardinia. "Return immediately with every warrior. The demons of Rome walk again. Their general is not human. He knows our thoughts before we think them." What Gelimer didn't know was that Belisarius was reading these letters, having bribed Gelimer's messenger with a sum that would have bought a small city. This intelligence allowed him to prepare for the final confrontation with surgical precision. He knew Zazo would land at Carthage's second harbor. He knew the combined Vandal force would number around 15,000. He knew Gelimer planned to attack on December 15th, after Zazo's arrival, so Belisarius decided to attack on December 14th. The Battle of Tricamarum was fought in a valley that looked like God had designed it for dramatic endings. Mountains on three sides, a river cutting through the center, and mist that turned men into shadows until they were close enough to smell each other's fear. Belisarius had 8,000 men. His force had been reduced by garrison duties against 15,000 Vandals fighting for their kingdom's survival. The odds should have mattered. They didn't. Belisarius had noticed that Vandal cavalry, raised in luxury, couldn't fight effectively without their servants nearby to hand them fresh lances. So he ordered his horse archers, Huns who could put an arrow through a ring at full gallop, to target the servants first. Within minutes, the Vandal nobility were fumbling with their own equipment, like children trying on their father's armor. The decisive moment came when Zazo, Gelimer's brother and the Vandals' best commander, led a charge directly at Belisarius's position. The Roman general, in a move that would have been suicidal for anyone else, ordered his center to open. Simply step aside and let the Vandals through. Zazo's cavalry thundered into empty space, then found themselves surrounded as the Roman wings collapsed inward. Zazo died with 17 arrows in him, still trying to reach Belisarius. When Gelimer saw his brother's head on a Roman spear, something broke inside him. The last king of Vandal Africa dropped his sword, turned his horse, and rode away from the battlefield without a word. His army, seeing their king flee for the second time, dissolved like salt in water. The pursuit was almost anticlimactic. Gelimer fled to a mountain fortress where the Berbers, whom the Vandals had oppressed for a century, kept him trapped but alive. They wanted to sell him to Belisarius, not kill him. The negotiation for Gelimer's surrender was handled by Faras, a Herul mercenary whose diplomatic style consisted of standing outside the fortress and shouting, "You can come down walking or in pieces, but you're coming down." After 3 months of eating grass and watching his children starve, Gelimer surrendered. His only request was for a sponge to clean himself, a loaf of bread — he hadn't tasted wheat in weeks — and a lyre to compose a lament for his kingdom. Belisarius granted all three, then shipped him to Constantinople, where he would live in comfortable exile, writing bad poetry about the fickleness of fortune. The treasure Belisarius sent back to Constantinople defied calculation. The Vandals had been looting for a century, accumulating wealth that included not just gold and silver, but artifacts beyond price. The sacred vessels from Jerusalem's temple, taken by Titus in 70 AD, stolen by Vandals from Rome in 455, now returning to a Christian empire. There were statues by Praxiteles, paintings by Apelles, enough gold to fund 10 years of wars. Procopius, trying to calculate the value, simply wrote, "more than could be counted." But the real prize was strategic. Control of Africa meant control of the Mediterranean's grain supply. Carthage's workshops could build ships. Its ports could project power into Italy, Spain, anywhere. In 6 months, with less than 10,000 men, Belisarius had not just conquered a kingdom, he had revolutionized the mathematics of empire. Back in Constantinople, Justinian received the news with emotions that his court chroniclers carefully didn't record. His general had achieved the impossible, validating the emperor's wildest dreams of restoration. But that same general was now more popular than any emperor. His name on every citizen's lips, his victories the subject of tavern songs that conspicuously forgot to mention who had ordered the campaign. Justinian's response was masterful in its calculated ambiguity. A triumph for Belisarius, the first granted to a non-emperor in 500 years, but held on a Tuesday, not the traditional Sunday, with a route that carefully avoided the Hippodrome where crowds might grow too large. Belisarius walked the purple carpet, Gelimer in chains behind him, while Justinian watched from a throne elevated so high that the victorious general had to crane his neck to see his emperor. The message was clear. You may conquer kingdoms, but you kneel to me. At the triumph's climax, in a moment that revealed everything about both men, Belisarius was offered the traditional honor to execute Gelimer personally, demonstrating Roman justice. Instead, he whispered something to Justinian, who nodded. Gelimer was not only spared, but given an estate in Galatia. Later, Antonina asked why he had shown mercy. Belisarius's answer was either profoundly wise or dangerously naive. Gelimer was a king. Justinian might one day fear, "I know how to kill kings." Antonina laughed, that dangerous laugh that suggested she knew things others didn't. "My darling fool, he already fears that. The question is what he'll do about it." The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. Within weeks of the triumph, new orders arrived. Take 5,000 men and reconquer Italy from the Goths. It was either the ultimate honor or a death sentence disguised as glory. Sicily first, then the mainland, then Rome itself. The eternal city, in Gothic hands for 40 years, waiting for a Roman general to reclaim it. As Belisarius studied maps of Italy, Procopius noticed him tracing the route to Rome over and over, like a lover writing his beloved's name. "Do you think we can do it?" the secretary asked. Belisarius's response would prove prophetic. "Taking Rome will be easy. Holding it will cost everything." The ships for Italy were already being prepared. Theodora was selecting which of Antonina's servants were actually spies. Justinian was calculating how much victory he could afford before his general became a threat requiring elimination. And Belisarius, the last Roman, was about to discover that conquering barbarians was simple compared to surviving success in Byzantium's snake pit of imperial politics. The reconquest of the West had begun. It would end in glory, treachery, and a kind of tragedy that even Greek playwrights would have considered excessive. But first, there would be Rome. The letter from Theodahad, Gothic king of Italy, arrived in Constantinople, written on purple vellum with gold ink, proposing the most insulting deal in diplomatic history. He would sell Belisarius the island of Sicily for enough gold to fill 3 ships. "Your general seems fond of purchasing victories," the Gothic king wrote. "Let him purchase this one." Justinian's response was to reduce Belisarius's invasion force from 15,000 to 7,500 men. Not from spite, but from calculation. If Belisarius failed with so few, it was Gothic strength, not imperial weakness. If he succeeded, well, even success could be managed. The general received these numbers without complaint, though his quartermaster Constantine allegedly said, "At this rate, we'll conquer Rome with a dinner party." Belisarius's reply became legend among his officers. "Christ fed 5,000 with 5 loaves. I have 7,500 men. The mathematics of heaven are different from those of earth." Sicily fell like a house with its foundations eaten by termites, intact one moment, collapsed the next. Belisarius landed at Catana in July 535, where the Gothic garrison commander, a wine-sodden fool named Cinderic, was in the middle of his daughter's wedding. The Romans literally walked into the city during the feast, and Cinderic, deep in his cups, offered to surrender if Belisarius would join the celebration. The Roman general not only accepted, but gave the bride a necklace that had belonged to a Vandal queen, a gift worth a fortune that secured the loyalty of every Sicilian who heard about it. By the time word reached Palermo, the city's Gothic defenders were already debating whether to negotiate terms or simply open the gates and hope for similar generosity. Palermo, however, had walls that touched the clouds and a garrison that still remembered what Gothic pride meant. The siege should have taken months. Belisarius took it in a single afternoon through a trick so audacious that Gothic chronicles accused him of witchcraft. He noticed that Palermo's walls, while high, came right to the harbor's edge at low tide. At high tide, ships' masts reached nearly to the battlements. So he lashed ships together, built platforms between the masts, and filled them with archers. When the tide rose, an entire Roman assault force materialized at the top of Palermo's impregnable walls, like they had climbed Jacob's ladder from the sea. The Gothic garrison, convinced they were fighting demons who could fly, surrendered immediately. One old Gothic warrior allegedly asked Belisarius how he had made his men fly. The general's response: "The same way you made Rome fall, by doing what no one expected. But Naples was where the war revealed its true nature, not glorious conquest, but grinding brutality. The city had a mixed population: Gothic garrison, Italian aristocrats, Jewish merchants, Greek artisans, and a mob that changed loyalty with the wind. When Belisarius arrived in October 535, the Neapolitans couldn't decide whether they were being liberated or conquered. The Gothic garrison was strong enough to resist, but not strong enough to win. The Italian nobles feared Gothic retribution if they opened the gates, but Roman taxes if they didn't. The Jews, remembering Byzantine persecution, actively supported the Goths. For 20 days, Belisarius besieged a city that seemed to be besieging itself, with different factions controlling different walls, some fighting, others negotiating, everyone waiting for someone else to make a decision. The solution came from an Azorian soldier named Paucarus, who had the useful habit of exploring sewers, not from courage, but because he had discovered that people often dropped coins in drains. He found an abandoned aqueduct that led into the city, wide enough for armed men if they didn't mind wading through centuries of accumulated filth. Belisarius sent 600 men through this tunnel of horrors, led by Magnus, a giant Goth fighting for Rome because Theodahad had executed his father. They emerged inside Naples like creatures from Tartarus, covered in excrement and blood, spreading panic that the Romans had raised the dead. The city fell in chaos so complete that Belisarius spent 3 days just trying to stop his own men from sacking it. The Jewish quarter burned despite his orders. Gothic civilians were massacred in churches. It was the kind of victory that felt like defeat. Theodahad, receiving news of Naples' fall, responded by doing absolutely nothing. He sat in his palace in Ravenna, writing commentary on Platonic philosophy, and consulting soothsayers about whether the stars favored resistance. His own warriors, disgusted by a king who quoted Greek poetry while Rome's ancient territories fell, did what Goths traditionally did with unsatisfactory kings. They killed him. At a military assembly near Terracina, they raised on their shields one Vitiges, a grizzled veteran who had fought under the great Theodoric. His acceptance speech was brief. Belisarius has 7,000 men. We have 150,000. If we cannot crush him, we deserve to lose Italy. The Gothic nation roared approval and prepared for a war that would make Naples look like a dinner party disagreement. But Vitiges made the mistake that doomed the Gothic cause. He decided to secure his northern borders before dealing with Belisarius. He withdrew to Ravenna, married Theodoric's granddaughter to legitimize his coup, and spent precious weeks negotiating with the Franks. This gave Belisarius the one thing he needed more than soldiers, supplies, or divine intervention: time. On December 9th, 536, with Vitiges 500 miles away and only 4,000 demoralized Goths holding Rome, Belisarius appeared at the Asinarian Gate. The Gothic commander, Luderus, looked at the Roman force, still only 7,000 men, now reduced by garrison duties, and made a calculation that would echo through history. He could fight and probably hold Rome for weeks, maybe months, or he could surrender and live. He chose life, opening the gates to the Eternal City. Belisarius entered Rome not as a conqueror, but as a ghost returning home. The Roman population, perhaps 300,000 souls where once 1,000,000 had lived, watched in stunned silence as actual Roman soldiers marched down the Via Triumphalis for the first time in 60 years. Old men wept. Children, raised on stories of ancient glory, asked if these were really Romans or just another tribe of barbarians pretending. The Senate, reduced to a ceremonial body that rubber-stamped Gothic decrees, suddenly remembered they were supposed to be the spiritual government of the world. They met Belisarius in the Forum, wearing togas that moths had been eating for decades, and formally welcomed him in Latin so archaic that even he struggled to understand it. But the triumphant entry was also a trap snapping shut. Rome's walls, 12 miles in circumference, required 30,000 men to defend properly. Belisarius had 5,000, having left detachments across Sicily and southern Italy. The aqueducts that fed the city could be cut. The harbour at Portus could be blockaded. And Vitiges, now secure in the north, was marching south with an army so large that Gothic scouts simply reported it as innumerable, though Byzantine intelligence put it at 150,000 warriors, plus servants, camp followers, and siege equipment that included towers tall enough to overlook Rome's walls and catapults that could throw stones weighing as much as a horse. Belisarius had perhaps 3 months before this avalanche of Gothic fury reached Rome. He used every hour like a man possessed. The walls were repaired with materials stripped from pagan temples. Apollo's marble became battlements. Jupiter's columns became catapult ammunition. He trained Roman civilians, soft from centuries of bread and circuses, to become soldiers. Bakers learned to shoot crossbows. Aristocrats who hadn't walked a mile in their lives found themselves in armor, marching circuits on the walls. Most brilliantly, he created a mobile reserve of 2,000 cavalry who could reach any threatened section of wall within minutes, making his 5,000 defenders seem like 15,000 to any attacker. The preparation took on an almost mystical quality. Belisarius seemed to never sleep, appearing on different sections of the wall at all hours, always knowing exactly where weakness lay. He had the city's astrologers, normally occupied, predicting race outcomes at the Circus Maximus, calculate the trajectories of siege weapons. He turned the mausoleum of Hadrian into a fortress, replacing funeral urns with arrow bundles. The Colosseum became a weapons factory. The baths of Caracalla, dry for decades, became barracks. Rome was transforming from museum to fortress, and its population was either terrified or exhilarated, depending on whether they believed this small, young general could actually defend them against the Gothic nation in arms. In February 537, as spring approached, and with it Vitiges' army, something extraordinary happened. Pope Silverius, technically the most powerful religious figure in the West, came to Belisarius with a proposition from Vitiges. Surrender Rome peacefully, and the Goths would make him king of Italy, independent of Constantinople. It was the same offer the Goths had made before Ravenna, and it revealed that even Rome's enemies recognized his genius. Belisarius' response was to have the Pope's letter read publicly in the Forum, then declare, "I serve one emperor on earth and one God in heaven. Both would be poorly served by treachery." The crowd, which had been wavering, suddenly hardened. If Belisarius would refuse a crown to defend them, they would refuse surrender to support him. On February 21st, 537, Gothic outriders appeared on the horizon. By March 2nd, Vitiges' full army had arrived, covering the Campania like a locust plague. Contemporary accounts struggle to convey the size. Gothic warriors filled 7 separate camps, each larger than many cities. Their watchfires at night turned darkness into orange twilight. The sound of their weapons being sharpened was audible inside Rome, a metallic whisper that never stopped. Vitiges sent a herald to the walls with a simple message: "Surrender now and live as our subjects. Resist and watch your city become ash." Belisarius' response was to have his best archer, a Hun named Chorsomantis, shoot an arrow that landed at the herald's feet, missing him by inches. Attached was a note. That was a warning shot. The next won't be. The siege of Rome was about to begin. 150,000 Goths against 5,000 Romans and whatever civilians could hold a spear. The mathematics were impossible. The walls were too long, the defenders too few. Any rational calculation said Rome would fall within weeks. But Belisarius had long ago learned that war wasn't about rational calculations. It was about making your enemy believe they had already lost, even when every visible sign said they were winning. Over the next year, he would turn Rome into a classroom where the Gothic nation would receive a fatal education in the difference between having superior numbers and having Belisarius as an enemy. The first Gothic assault came on March 12th, and it came like the end of the world. Siege towers rolled forward, so tall that Roman defenders had to look up to see Gothic archers. Battering rams the size of shipmasts swung toward gates that hadn't been seriously tested in living memory. Vitiges himself, in golden armor that caught the sun like a second sun, directed operations from a pavilion, close enough that Romans could see him pointing at different sections of wall. The Goths were confident, professional, and absolutely certain that the first day would be the last day. They were wrong. As the siege towers approached, Belisarius revealed his first surprise. Every piece of Roman artillery had been recalibrated using those astronomical calculations. The ballistae didn't just hit the towers, they hit specific joints, specific wheels, causing the massive structures to collapse like broken toys. The Goths watched months of work destroyed in minutes. But that was just the beginning of their education. The Goths brought a battering ram to the Salarian gate that they called the City Taker, a tree trunk from the forests of Germania, capped with a bronze head shaped like a snarling wolf, requiring 50 men to swing it. On March 18, 537, it approached the gate under a protective shed of overlapping shields, while Gothic warriors sang death songs that hadn't been heard since their ancestors sacked Rome in 410. Belisarius, watching from the wall, turned to his artillery commander, a Syrian named Theodosius, who claimed he could calculate the flight of angels, and said simply, "Make them regret bringing wood to a stone fight." What followed was a masterclass in applied geometry. The Roman catapults didn't target the ram, but the ground in front of it, creating craters that broke the wheels of its carriage. The ballistae shot not stones, but containers of Greek fire that turned the protective shed into a crematorium. Within an hour, the City Taker was charcoal, and 50 Gothic warriors were running back to their lines with their beards on fire. But Vitiges was no fool. For every Roman cleverness, he had Gothic determination. He ordered his men to fill the defensive ditches around Rome with fascines, bundles of wood and brush, working at night to avoid Roman artillery. By day 20 of the siege, Gothic troops could reach the walls without crossing open ground. The assault of March 21st involved 18 simultaneous attacks on different gates, forcing Belisarius to ride between positions like a man trying to plug leaks in a dam with his fingers. At the Praenestine Gate, Goths with scaling ladders nearly took the wall before Belisarius arrived with his bucellari, who killed climbers with such mechanical efficiency that Gothic bodies piled up at the base of the wall, high enough to form a second rampart. At the Flaminian Gate, the commander Constantinus held against 5,000 Goths with 300 men by convincing them through trumpet signals and dust clouds that massive reinforcements were arriving every few minutes. The mausoleum of Hadrian became the stuff of nightmares for Gothic attackers. Belisarius had fortified it as a forward position, connected to the city walls by covered passages. When the Goths assaulted it on March 27th, the defenders ran out of arrows and catapult stones. In desperation, they began throwing the mausoleum's statuary. Priceless works of art became weapons of war. A marble Aphrodite shattered a siege ladder. A bronze Perseus crushed a Gothic nobleman. The Emperor Hadrian's own funeral urn, a masterpiece of porphyry, killed 3 warriors when dropped from the ramparts. The Goths retreated, literally beaten by Rome's artistic heritage. One Gothic chronicler wrote, "Even their dead emperors fight against us." By April, the siege had settled into a routine that was slowly strangling Rome. Vitiges had cut all 14 aqueducts, reducing the city's water supply to the Tiber and a few wells. The mills that ground grain couldn't operate without water flow. Belisarius's solution was ingenious and desperate. He mounted mills on boats moored in the Tiber, using the current to turn the wheels. The Goths responded by throwing logs and corpses into the river to jam the mechanisms. Belisarius countered with chains across the river to catch debris. The Goths sent swimmers to cut the chains. The Romans posted archers to shoot the swimmers. Each side's solution created new problems in an escalating spiral of innovation and counter-innovation that turned the Tiber into an engineering battlefield. Food was running out, but morale was collapsing faster. Roman civilians who had cheered Belisarius in December now muttered that Gothic rule hadn't been so bad. At least there was bread. A delegation of senators came to Belisarius in April, suggesting a negotiated surrender. His response was to take them on a tour of his preparations. The walls where every stone had been checked and reinforced, the towers where artillery had overlapping fields of fire, the hospitals where wounded soldiers were returning to duty rather than dying of infection, thanks to Egyptian doctors who boiled their instruments in wine. But his masterstroke was showing them a secret workshop where Syrian engineers were building something new, a portable ballista light enough for 2 men to carry, but powerful enough to penetrate Gothic shields at 200 paces. "Gentlemen," he told the senators, "we're not just defending Rome. We're revolutionizing warfare." The psychological battle was as intense as the physical one. Belisarius ordered his men to laugh whenever they saw Goths, loud, mocking laughter that carried across the lines. It drove the Germanic warriors insane with rage. They would charge the walls in fury, straight into prepared killing fields. On April 20th, a Gothic champion named Vandals, famous for killing 30 men in single combat, challenged any Roman to face him. Belisarius himself started to descend from the walls, but his men physically restrained him. The general was too valuable to risk. Instead, an Armenian auxiliary named Artabazes volunteered. The combat lasted less than a minute. Artabazes feigned a stumble, let Vandals overextend on his attack, then opened his throat with an upward cut that sprayed blood 20 feet. The psychological impact was worth 1,000 soldiers. Gothic morale plummeted. But the Goths' greatest weapon was time, and they knew it. By May, Rome was starving. Cats sold for 3 gold pieces. Mothers were mixing sawdust into bread to make it last longer. The poor were eating grass, leather, anything that might fill their stomachs. Bodies appeared in the streets each morning, dead from hunger or the diseases that followed malnutrition. Belisarius had to post guards at the gates, not to keep Goths out, but to keep Romans from deserting. Yet he maintained iron discipline among his troops, executing any soldier caught hoarding food. When his own groom was discovered with hidden grain, Belisarius had him flogged publicly, declaring, "We all starve equally, or we all survive equally." Then came the night raids that made Belisarius a legend among both Romans and Goths. He would take 200 cavalry, never more, often less, and strike Gothic camps in darkness. Not to inflict casualties, though they did, but to destroy sleep itself. Gothic sentries became so paranoid that they raised alarms at shadows, exhausting their own army with false alerts. On May 15th, Belisarius led a raid that burned the Gothic siege equipment depot, destroying 3 months of construction in 30 minutes. The Goths rebuilt. He burned it again on May 22nd. They rebuilt again. He burned it again on May 30th. Vitiges posted 1,000 guards around the depot. Belisarius stopped raiding it, letting the Goths exhaust themselves, guarding equipment they were now too afraid to use. The plague arrived in June like a third army, killing both besieger and besieged without discrimination. The Gothic camps, overcrowded and unsanitary, suffered worse. Vitiges lost perhaps 20,000 men to disease. Their bodies burned in massive pyres that turned the sky black with greasy smoke. Inside Rome, Belisarius organized the city with ruthless efficiency. Corpses were immediately removed, infected houses were quarantined, and his Egyptian doctors introduced a treatment involving fermented bread mold that actually seemed to help. History's first recorded use of primitive antibiotics, though no one understood why it worked. The death rate inside Rome, while terrible, was half that in the Gothic camps. By July, both sides were exhausted, but the Goths were also humiliated. They outnumbered the Romans 30-1 and couldn't take the city. Vitiges tried one last stratagem. He would build a siege tower so massive that no wall could resist it, protected by 1,000 archers and pushed by 2,000 men. It took 6 weeks to build, standing 70 feet tall, wrapped in wet hides to resist fire. On August 30th, it began its slow advance toward the Aurelian Wall. Belisarius watched it approach for 3 days, letting Gothic hopes rise with each yard gained. Then, when it was perfectly positioned, he revealed his counter-preparation. His engineers had undermined the road, supporting it with wooden posts. When the tower reached the designated spot, Romans in the sewers knocked out the posts. The tower tilted, creaked, and collapsed into a prepared pit, taking 1,000 Goths with it. The psychological blow was terminal. Vitiges called for a parley on September 1st. The Gothic king, who had aged 10 years and 6 months, met Belisarius on neutral ground between the walls and Gothic lines. "How do you do it?" Vitiges asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "How do 5,000 hold against 150,000? Belisarius' answer became legendary. "You fight to conquer. I fight to not lose. As long as one Roman stands on these walls, Rome hasn't fallen. You need total victory. I need only survival." Vitiges proposed a truce. The Goths would withdraw if Belisarius promised not to pursue. The Roman general refused. "You may leave whenever you wish. I'll pursue whenever I choose." The Gothic withdrawal began in March 538, after 1 year and 9 days of siege. They had lost perhaps 60,000 men to combat, disease, and desertion. The Roman losses were 4,000 soldiers and unknown thousands of civilians. As the Gothic army retreated north, burning everything in their path, Roman cavalry harassed them constantly. Not major attacks, just enough to remind them that they were fleeing, not withdrawing. Belisarius stood on the walls watching the Gothic camps burn, and his secretary Procopius recorded his words. "They came as conquerors and leave as fugitives. Let all who would take Rome know. She may be wounded, she may be reduced, but she remembers how to fight." But the victory was Pyrrhic in every sense. Rome was saved but ruined, its population reduced by 2/3, its aqueducts destroyed, its commercial life ended. The Goths were beaten but not broken, retreating to Ravenna to regroup. And most ominously, dispatches from Constantinople brought not congratulations, but suspicion. Justinian wrote asking why Belisarius hadn't pursued more aggressively, wondering if his general was preserving Gothic strength for his own purposes. Theodore's letters to Antonina were worse, full of insinuations that Belisarius was becoming too beloved by the Romans, too feared by the barbarians. The success that should have secured his position had instead marked him for destruction. The final insult came with reinforcements, 7,000 troops under Narses, the eunuch who had helped during the Nika riots, but now arrived with secret orders from Justinian to watch Belisarius for signs of excessive ambition. The two commanders met in the ruins of the Forum, surrounded by statues of ancient Romans who had won similar victories and been similarly rewarded with suspicion. "Congratulations on your impossible victory," Narses said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Now let's see if you can survive your success." The Gothic crown arrived at Belisarius's tent in a cedar box lined with purple silk, carried by 3 Gothic nobles who looked like they were delivering their own death warrants. It was October the 539th, outside the walls of Ravenna, and the war had devolved into a bloody stalemate that was killing Italy itself. The crown, iron wrapped in gold, supposedly forged from a nail of the true cross, had been worn by Theodoric the Great, by Athalaric, by every Gothic king of Italy. Now the desperate Gothic nobility were offering it to their conqueror. "Rule us," said Urius, spokesman for the Gothic aristocracy. "Better a strong Roman emperor in Ravenna than a weak Gothic one. Better you than Justinian, who will bleed us with taxes and theology." Belisarius held the crown up to the lamplight, studying it like a mathematician examining a particularly complex equation, then spoke the words that would either save or damn him. "Give me 3 days." The path to this moment had been paved with corpses and betrayal. After Rome, the war had turned savage. Vitiges, reinforced by Frankish allies who killed Romans and Goths indiscriminately, had made every northern Italian city a fortress. Milan had fallen to the Goths in March 539, and what happened there made Rome's siege look civilized. The Gothic commander, Urias, nephew of Vitiges, ordered every male killed. 300,000, according to Procopius, though modern historians suggest 30,000. The women were given to the Burgundians as slaves. The city was razed so thoroughly that grass grew in its forums within a year. When Belisarius heard the news, witnesses say he didn't speak for 3 days, just stared at maps showing all the cities he still had to take, calculating how many more Milans there would be. Narses, meanwhile, had turned the Roman command structure into a snake pit. He contradicted Belisarius's orders, encouraged other generals to operate independently, and sent constant reports to Constantinople, suggesting that defeats were due to Belisarius's caution, while victories were despite it. The Roman force split into factions, those loyal to Belisarius, those seeking favor with Narses, and those just trying to survive the political crossfire. At Fiesole, John the Sanguinary, Belisarius's own nephew, refused a direct order to reinforce Milan, claiming Narses had told him to hold position. The result was Milan's destruction, and a command crisis that nearly collapsed the entire Italian campaign. Justinian's solution was to recall Narses, but the damage was done. Every Roman officer now knew that disobeying Belisarius might be rewarded rather than punished. The siege of Oximum in early 539 showed Belisarius at his most desperate and brilliant. The city sat on a mountain so steep that siege equipment was useless. The Gothic garrison of 4,000 could hold against 40,000. Belisarius had 8,000 men and no time. Frankish armies were raiding from the north, Persian threats were rising in the east, and Justinian's letters grew increasingly impatient. His solution was magnificent in its simplicity. He didn't siege Oximum, he performed it. He had his men build massive siege works that were completely fake, wooden towers that couldn't stand, catapults that couldn't shoot, covered galleries that led nowhere. But at night, his engineers were digging, not tunnels to undermine walls, but cisterns to poison water supplies with substances that caused temporary blindness. When half the Gothic garrison woke, unable to see, the other half panicked, convinced Belisarius had divine power. The city surrendered to an army that couldn't have taken it by force in 100 years. But Ravenna was different. The city was impregnable, surrounded by marshes that made siege equipment impossible, supplied by sea, which the Romans couldn't blockade, defended by 30,000 warriors who knew surrender meant death. Vitiges had learned from Rome. He wouldn't be starved out or tricked. The city could hold forever, and both sides knew it. Which is why the Gothic nobles' offer of the crown was both opportunity and trap. Accept it, and Belisarius would have Italy, but lose his head when Justinian heard, refuse it, and the war would continue until Italy was a desert. The Gothic envoys waited in their camp, sending daily messages asking for his decision. Belisarius sent back increasingly cryptic responses. The crown is heavy. Purple fades in Italian sun. Even Augustus was once Octavian. On the second night, Antonina came to his tent with news that changed everything. She had been in secret correspondence with Theodora, and the Empress's latest letter was explicit. "My husband grows tired of victories that cost more than defeats. End this war by winter, or be ended yourself." It wasn't a threat. Theodora didn't make threats, only promises. Antonina also brought intelligence from her network of spies. Justinian was negotiating with the Goths behind Belisarius's back, prepared to let them keep everything north of the Po River. The general who had conquered Africa and saved Rome was about to be undercut by his own emperor, unless he moved first. The plan Belisarius conceived was either treason or brilliance, depending on who wrote the history. He sent secret messages to the Gothic nobles accepting their offer. He would become Western Emperor, independent of Constantinople. But first, they must convince Vitiges to open Ravenna's gates, promising the old king safe exile. Meanwhile, he sent different messages to his own officers, telling them to prepare for immediate withdrawal to Rome, suggesting the campaign was over. To Justinian, he sent reports of supply shortages, disease, and Gothic strength, preparing the emperor for news of negotiated peace. Every party heard what they wanted to hear. Every party thought they were winning. Everyone was wrong. On December 5th, 539, Belisarius approached Ravenna with just 300 men. His personal bucellari, the only troops he trusted absolutely. The Gothic nobles had succeeded. Vitiges had agreed to surrender in exchange for safe passage to Constantinople. The gates opened. Belisarius entered Ravenna, not as conqueror, but as invited king. Gothic warriors lined the streets, not threatening but saluting. The nobility waited in Theodoric's palace with the crown. The Bishop of Ravenna stood ready to perform a coronation that would split the Roman Empire in half. And Belisarius, walking through streets where no Roman general had stepped in 40 years, played his role perfectly. Until he didn't. The moment of revelation was theatrical beyond fiction. In the palace throne room, with Gothic nobility assembled, with Vitiges already departed for exile, with the crown held out by trembling hands, Belisarius spoke. "I accept your surrender in the name of Emperor Justinian." The silence was so complete that witnesses claimed they could hear snow falling outside. Then chaos, Gothic nobles reaching for swords they had been made to leave outside, cursing in languages that hadn't been heard since the forests of Germania, one old warrior literally dying of shock on the marble floor. But it was too late. Roman troops, who had infiltrated the city disguised as merchants over the previous week, secured the gates. The Gothic kingdom of Italy, which had endured since Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor in 476, ended not with a battle, but with a lie. The aftermath was swift and methodical. The Gothic treasury, accumulated over 60 years of rule, was catalogued and shipped to Constantinople, gold that would fund Justinian's building of Hagia Sophia. Gothic warriors were given a choice: join Roman armies or leave Italy. Most chose to leave, dispersing across Europe, their kingdom dissolving like salt in rain. The Gothic nobility were treated with surprising courtesy. Belisarius insisted on this, knowing that cruelty would spark rebellions. But the real revelation came in documents found in Vitiges' palace, correspondence showing that several Roman senators had been negotiating with the Goths, that Narses had been in contact with Frankish kings, that everyone had been betraying everyone. Belisarius burned these letters unread, at least publicly. Privately, Antonina memorized every name, but the true price of the deception revealed itself in a letter from Justinian that arrived 2 weeks after Ravenna's fall. Instead of congratulations, it contained a single line: "Return immediately, bring the Gothic treasure, leave the Gothic crown." The implication was clear. Justinian knew about the offer, knew about the temptation, and wanted his general where he could see him. But there was a second letter, this one from Theodora to Antonina. "Your husband played his part perfectly. The emperor believes he nearly turned traitor. This is good. Men who are suspected of small treasons are rarely suspected of great ones." The journey back to Constantinople in early 540 was a triumph that felt like a funeral procession. Italian cities that Belisarius had liberated now begged him not to leave, knowing that without his protection, they would face Gothic remnants, Frankish raiders, and imperial tax collectors who were often worse than both. In Rome, the Senate met him on the Milvian Bridge, offering him the ancient title of patrician if he would stay as military governor. He refused, knowing that accepting any honor not granted by Justinian was stepping closer to the executioner's block. Pope Vigilius blessed him publicly while privately writing to Constantinople that Belisarius had too much love from the people, too much mercy for enemies. The most poignant moment came at the port of Brundisium, where ships waited to carry him back to Constantinople. A delegation of Gothic warriors, men who had fought against him for 4 years, came to bid farewell. Their spokesman, a grizzled veteran named Totila, who would later lead a Gothic resurgence, said simply, "You conquered us with honor. Our next conqueror will use only hunger and murder." Belisarius's response revealed either prophetic wisdom or deep cynicism. "I conquered nothing. I was a sword in another's hand. When I'm gone, that hand will find other swords, less careful about what they cut." As his ship sailed east, Belisarius stood at the stern, watching Italy fade into morning mist. Antonina found him there, still watching when land had long vanished. "You could have kept it," she said quietly. "The crown, the Gothic kingdom, the West." His answer explained everything and nothing. Justinian would have sent someone to take it back. That someone wouldn't have been gentle. Better that Italy remembers me as the general who conquered with mercy than the rebel who brought destruction. Antonina laughed, that dangerous laugh that suggested knowledge others didn't possess. "My dear fool, they'll send someone anyway. And yes, he won't be gentle." She was right. Within 2 years, Italy would be in flames again. The Goths would rise under Totila, reclaiming everything Belisarius had conquered. Narses would return with an army that cared nothing for Italian suffering. The war would continue for another 15 years, leaving Italy so devastated that it wouldn't recover for centuries. But in 540, sailing back to Constantinople with Gothic treasure in his hold and Gothic crown left behind, Belisarius had achieved something remarkable. He had conquered a kingdom, refused an empire, and survived both. The question was whether he could survive what came next: success in Justinian's Constantinople, where being too good at your job was the greatest treason of all. The letter appointing Belisarius as commander of the East arrived wrapped in silk, the color of dried blood, which should have been warning enough. It was May 540, and Khosrau of Persia had just done the unthinkable. He had captured Antioch, the third greatest city in the Roman Empire, and was currently using its Hippodrome to stage chariot races where he played the role of Roman emperor, complete with stolen purple robes and a crown made from melted Byzantine gold. The real insult wasn't the conquest, but the theater. Khosrau had renamed Antioch better than Antioch, and was rebuilding it near his capital as a theme park of Roman humiliation. Justinian's response was to send Belisarius east with 5,000 men, and instructions that amounted to perform a miracle with pocket change. Constantinople received its returning hero with all the warmth of a winter tomb. There was no triumph for Ravenna, no parade for conquering Italy. Instead, Belisarius was summoned to the palace at midnight, made to wait 3 hours in an anteroom where courtiers pretended not to recognize him, then ushered into Justinian's presence, where the emperor sat surrounded by the Gothic treasure Belisarius had sent, using it as furniture, drinking from Theodoric's goblet, his feet resting on a chest containing the crown jewels of dead kings. "You did adequately in Italy," Justinian said, not looking up from a document he was reading. "Now go do adequately against Persia." The audience lasted less than a minute. The message was clear. Heroes were dangerous. Adequate servants were useful. The journey east revealed an empire bleeding from self-inflicted wounds. Every city demanded garrison troops Belisarius didn't have. Every fortress commander wanted reinforcements he couldn't spare. At Caesarea, he found the army of the East in ruins. 20,000 men on paper, 8,000 in reality, and those mostly Syrian militia who ran at the sight of Persian cavalry. His predecessor Buses was in chains, accused of cowardice for losing Antioch. His officers were either incompetent cousins of senators or competent men terrified of showing initiative. The treasury allocated for the Eastern War would have been insulting if it hadn't been obviously calculated to ensure failure. Belisarius had conquered Africa with 15,000 men and Italy with 7,000. Now, he was expected to stop the Persian Empire with 5,000 and whatever local forces he could terrorize into competence. The first meeting with his Eastern officers was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Belisarius had them assembled in the ruins of a church Khosrau had burned, its blackened walls still smelling of smoke. He didn't speak for 10 minutes, just walked among the rubble, occasionally picking up fragments. A piece of burnt gospel, a melted chalice, a child's toy fused with glass from the heat. Finally he spoke. "Khosrau thinks we're weak because we are weak. He's right. We can't match his numbers, his cavalry, his treasury." The officers shifted nervously. Then Belisarius smiled, the expression of a man about to share a delicious secret. But Khosrau makes one mistake. He thinks wars are won by strength. I've taken cities with false information. I've destroyed armies with geometry. I've conquered kingdoms with lies. Strength is just one tool, and usually the crudest. We're going to teach the Shah of Shahs that intelligence beats muscle, that speed beats size, and that Belisarius beats everyone. The campaign that followed defied every principle of ancient warfare. Instead of defending fortress cities, Belisarius abandoned them, leaving just enough garrison to make siege costly, but not enough to matter if they fell. Instead of seeking battle, he avoided it obsessively, shadowing Persian armies like a wolf following a bear, always visible, never catchable. He turned the eastern frontier into a psychological torture chamber for Persian commanders. Supply caravans would vanish in the night, guards found with their throats cut and their eyes removed. A calling card that said, "I was close enough to kill you all but chose not to." Persian armies would wake to find their water sources poisoned with substances that caused vivid hallucinations. Entire regiments would chase phantom Roman armies that were actually dust clouds created by dragging branches behind horses. The encounter at Nisibis in September 540 epitomized the new warfare. Khosrau himself led 30,000 men to besiege the fortress city. Belisarius had 1,200. Traditional strategy demanded he reinforce the city or attack to relieve it. Instead, he sent a prostitute named Euphemia, who spoke perfect Persian and claimed to be fleeing Roman persecution. She was welcomed into the Persian camp, where she spent 3 days gathering intelligence and spreading rumors that Belisarius commanded demonic forces. She had glass vials that she claimed contained the souls of Persian warriors, and when she broke them at night, the chemical reaction created screams that sounded genuinely human. On the fourth night, as Persian sentries jumped at shadows and whispers of demons spread through the camp, Belisarius attacked, not with his army, but with 200 men carrying trumpets, drums, and anything that made noise, attacking from 7 different directions in sequence, creating the illusion of an enormous force. The Persians, already half convinced they faced supernatural enemies, retreated from Nisibis without fighting a single real battle. But the masterstroke came at Sergiopolis in early 541. The city had fallen to Khosrau, who was using it as a forward base, storing supplies for a deeper invasion of Syria. Belisarius couldn't retake it by force, so he took it by fraud. He had a double agent, a Persian noble named Zaberganes, who owed him a life debt from the earlier wars, send word to Khosrau that plague had broken out in the Roman army, which was partially true. Disease was always present. But Belisarius had his infected soldiers, those showing visible symptoms, parade where Persian scouts could see them. Then he had the same soldiers, cleaned and dressed differently, parade again. And again, creating the illusion that his entire army was diseased. Khosrau, terrified of plague spreading to his forces, abandoned Sergiopolis so fast that he left behind his personal pavilion, which Belisarius promptly sent to Constantinople as proof of victory. The personal cost of this shadow war was destroying Belisarius from within. He hadn't seen Antonina in over a year. She remained in Constantinople, officially to manage his estates, but actually to navigate the snake pit of palace politics that would have devoured him in his absence. Her letters grew increasingly strange, full of references to "our dear friend," meaning Theodora, warnings about the weather changing, meaning Justinian's mood, and constant reminders to remember your place, meaning don't succeed too much. One letter contained a single line that chilled him. "Theodosius sends his regards from our bed." Whether she meant it as confession or threat, he never determined. Then came the miracle that saved and damned everything. Plague arrived in 541, but not the minor outbreak Belisarius had feigned. This was something new, something terrible, what later historians would call Justinian's plague, the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague. It hit Persian armies first, spreading from trade routes they controlled. Khosrau lost perhaps a third of his forces in weeks, men dying so fast that bodies were abandoned where they fell. The great Shah, who had humiliated Rome at Antioch, fled back to Persia, pursued by an enemy no army could defeat. But the plague didn't respect borders. By winter, it was ravaging Syria, moving west toward Constantinople. Belisarius found himself fighting 2 wars, one against Persia, one against disease. His solution to the plague was revolutionary and probably saved the empire. He quarantined not just the sick, but anyone who had contact with them, creating isolation zones enforced by troops who had already survived infection and seemed immune. He burned entire city quarters where plague concentrated. Most radically, he observed that plague spread along trade routes and ordered all commerce stopped, an economic disaster that prevented an epidemiological catastrophe. Persian armies, lacking such discipline, simply died. By spring 542, Khosrau sued for peace not because he was defeated, but because he had no army left to fight with. The peace treaty, signed in March 542, should have been Belisarius's greatest triumph. Persia agreed to massive tribute, returned captured cities, and acknowledged Roman supremacy in Armenia. But when the terms reached Constantinople, Justinian, himself recovering from plague that had nearly killed him, reacted with fury. The treaty was too generous, he declared. Belisarius should have demanded more gold, more territory, more humiliation. The real issue, whispered in palace corridors, was that Belisarius had succeeded again without the massive army Justinian had denied him, proving that the general's genius mattered more than imperial support. That was unforgivable. The recall letter arrived in April 542, Just 2 sentences. Return to Constantinople immediately. Bring no troops. The second sentence was the death threat. Generals who returned without their armies often didn't survive their homecomings. Belisarius's officers begged him to refuse, to declare independence with the eastern armies that adored him. You could be emperor of the East, Citus argued. Justinian is weakened by plague. The palace guard is decimated. The people would support you. Belisarius's response revealed either supreme loyalty or supreme fatalism. I've refused one crown already. Refusing a second would be redundant. Accepting it would be predictable. I prefer to remain mysterious. The journey back to Constantinople took 2 months, each day bringing news that made return seem more suicidal. Italy had exploded in rebellion. Totila had taken Rome, undoing in months what had taken years to accomplish. Africa was restless. The Balkans were being raided by Slavs. The empire was collapsing, and its greatest general was being recalled to almost certain imprisonment or death. Yet Belisarius continued west, stopping at Antioch to pray in the ruins of churches he hadn't been able to save, visiting battlefields where he had performed miracles with handfuls of men against multitudes. At the border of Anatolia, a messenger intercepted him with urgent news. Theodora was dead. The Empress, Antonina's protector, and Belisarius's hidden shield against Justinian's paranoia, had succumbed to cancer on June 28, 542. The messenger, one of Antonina's servants, had ridden horses to death, bringing warning. The mistress says, "Come if you must, but know that you come to a court where your only friend is in a tomb." Belisarius read the message twice, burned it, and continued toward Constantinople. When asked why he didn't flee, his answer was simple. "I've spent my life doing the impossible for an emperor who hates me for it. Why change now?" The gates of Constantinople appeared on the horizon on August 15, 542. The city that had once cheered him now seemed to hold its breath. The plague had killed perhaps a quarter of the population. Bodies were still being dumped in the sea. The living moved through streets like ghosts, cloth pressed to their faces, afraid of the very air. And somewhere in the palace, Justinian waited, scarred by disease, maddened by fever, convinced that every success of his greatest general was a step toward usurpation. Belisarius was returning not to reward, but to judgment, not as hero, but as suspect. The golden phase of his career was over. The bitter twilight was about to begin. The summons came at dawn on September 3rd, or 544, delivered by a eunuch who couldn't meet Belisarius's eyes. After 2 years of house arrest, politely termed administrative consultation, the general was ordered to the palace immediately. He found Justinian in the map room, staring at Italy like a man contemplating a tumor. Rome had fallen to Totila. Naples was gone. The Gothic king was issuing gold coins with his own face where emperors belonged. "Fix it," Justinian said without turning around. "Take 4,000 men and fix it." Belisarius studied the map, calculating distances, supplies, impossibilities. 4,000 won't reconquer Italy, Caesar. Justinian finally turned, his face still bearing plague scars that looked like constellation maps of suffering. "Then fail heroically. Either way, my problem is solved." The army Belisarius received was an insult wrapped in impossibility. 4,000 men. But what men? Isaurian mountaineers who had never seen the sea, Hungarian mercenaries whose loyalty expired with their pay, and the dregs of Constantinople's garrison, soldiers who had spent the plague years guarding empty granaries. His officers were worse, political appointees who bought their commissions, young aristocrats seeking glory without danger, and most gallingly, commanders specifically instructed by Justinian that they could disobey Belisarius if they disagreed with his tactics. The emperor had created a military democracy where every decision could be debated, every order questioned. It was designed to fail, and everyone knew it. Antonina insisted on accompanying him, bringing her household of 300 servants, spies, and whatever young men currently held her interest. Their marriage had become a public fiction, performed for political necessity. She hadn't shared his bed since Theodosius's death from plague, an event she blamed on divine punishment for their affair, though she seemed more angry at God than repentant. "Why Italy again?" she asked, as their ship passed through the Hellespont. "You already conquered it once." Belisarius's answer was bitter truth. "Because Justinian needs me to fail where I once succeeded." It completes the narrative. The aging general, past his prime, unable to repeat former glories. Very Greek, very satisfying. The Italy Belisarius found in 544 was unrecognizable from what he had left in 540. Totila hadn't just conquered, he had revolutionized. The Gothic king freed slaves who joined his army, redistributed land to peasants, and most brilliantly, treated captured Romans with such courtesy that cities began surrendering just to experience his mercy. He was playing Belisarius's own game from the First War, but better. When the Roman fleet arrived at Otranto in June 544, locals fled, thinking they were pirates. When Belisarius identified himself, they laughed. "Belisarius is a myth," one fisherman said, "a story Romans tell when they're losing." The first engagement at Pesaro proved everyone right about everything. Belisarius ordered a night attack on a Gothic camp. His Hungarian mercenaries attacked at sunset instead, claiming they misunderstood. The Isaurians refused to attack at all, saying their contracts specified daylight combat only. His Byzantine officers held a vote, an actual vote, on whether to proceed. By the time they decided, the Goths had escaped, leaving behind a message painted on a tent wall. "Belisarius used to be dangerous." The humiliation was complete, but it also freed something in the general. If he was commanding a farce, he might as well make it entertaining. What followed was the most brilliant asymmetric campaign in military history, fought not to win, but to not lose so spectacularly that your even defeat became a kind of victory. Belisarius couldn't take cities, so he performed elaborate fake sieges, complete with construction of siege equipment that couldn't actually function, forcing Goths to waste resources defending against attacks that would never come. He couldn't win battles, so he avoided them entirely, but spread rumors of victories so convincing that Gothic morale plummeted from fighting phantoms. At Oximum, he had his 200 reliable troops change armor repeatedly and march past the same point, creating the illusion of thousands. The Gothic garrison, convinced they faced a massive army, negotiated surrender. When they discovered the truth, their commander allegedly said, "We were defeated by theater." The letter from Totila arrived in December 544, written in perfect Latin with penmanship that would shame imperial scribes. To Belisarius, the shadow of what you were, I hold Rome. I hold Italy. You hold nothing but memories and soldiers who debate rather than fight. Go home, old man. Let Italy remember you as you were, not as you've become. The calculated insult worked perfectly, not on Belisarius, who was beyond pride, but on his fractious officers, who suddenly united in outrage that a barbarian would address a Roman general with such contempt. For the first time, they stopped debating and started fighting. The battle for Lucania in February 545 was military jazz. Improvised, chaotic, brilliant. Belisarius had 1,200 men who would actually fight. Totila had 8,000 veterans. The Roman general couldn't win conventionally, so he invented new conventions. He had his men attack in complete silence. No war cries, no trumpets, just the whisper of arrows and sudden death. The psychological effect was devastating. Goths broke because they couldn't understand an enemy that killed without sound. He used smoke screens made from burning olive oil mixed with sulfur, creating walls of acrid fog that hid numbers and movement. Most innovatively, he had his cavalry dismount and fight on foot while his infantry rode the horses. The reversal of roles confused Gothic responses, their tactics failing against an enemy that refused to fight properly. But the masterpiece was the Second Siege of Rome in 546. Totila held the city with 20,000 men. Belisarius had 4,000, half of whom were actively plotting desertion. A conventional siege was impossible, so Belisarius decided to make Rome irrelevant. He surrounded the city but made no attempt to take it, instead turning the siege into a philosophical statement. He had his men build gardens outside the walls, perform plays in view of Gothic sentries, hold athletic competitions as if war was a minor inconvenience. The message was clear: Rome might be occupied, but Roman life continued regardless. Totila, driven to fury, led sorties against an enemy that wouldn't fight back, just retreated, while musicians played comic songs about Gothic impatience. The climax came on December 17, 546, when Totila, exhausted by holding a city that no one was actually trying to take, decided to destroy Rome entirely, tear down the walls, burn the buildings, end the symbol if he couldn't hold the substance. He withdrew most of his garrison to oversee demolition. Belisarius waited exactly 1 day, then entered through a sewer grate with 300 men, while Totila's army was camped outside. By morning, Roman flags flew from Roman walls, and Totila faced the humiliation of having to besiege a city he had just abandoned. The Gothic king's rage was so intense that subordinates feared he would burst blood vessels. He had been outmaneuvered by a general commanding an army that barely qualified as a reinforced garrison. The respite lasted 40 days. Belisarius, working with desperate energy, rebuilt sections of Rome's walls using rubble from Totila's attempted demolition, trained civilian militia who were more enthusiastic than effective, and sent increasingly urgent messages to Constantinople for reinforcements that everyone knew would never come. When Totila returned with 30,000 men, every Goth who could hold a spear, Belisarius had perhaps 2,000 defenders and walls that were more suggestion than fortification. The second siege of Rome, the absurdity of the phrase captured the absurdity of the situation, lasted exactly 3 days before Belisarius performed his last great magic trick. He vanished. On the night of February 3rd, 547, Belisarius evacuated Rome through 7 different gates simultaneously, each group told they were the only ones leaving, each believing others were staying to hold the walls. By dawn, Totila entered a city defended by scarecrows dressed as soldiers, posted on walls by Belisarius's rear guard. The Gothic king found a note in the palace. "You wanted Rome. You have it. I wanted to prove I could take it from you whenever I chose. I have. Enjoy your empty victory." It was psychological warfare elevated to art, turning military defeat into moral victory, making Totila's conquest feel like Belisarius's gift. But the game was ending. In March 547, new orders arrived. Return to Constantinople immediately for consultation. This time, there was no pretense. Justinian wanted his general where he could see him, preferably in chains, but certainly in submission. The Italian campaign would continue under other commanders, men like John the Sanguinary, who believed brutality was strategy, or Bessus, who sold grain to starving Romans at prices that made usury look charitable. Belisarius toured his tiny army one last time, thanking men who had performed miracles with nothing, achieving the impossible by redefining what was possible. The Isaurians, who had refused to fight at Pesaro, wept at his departure. The Hungarians, mercenaries to their bones, refused their final pay, saying they had been paid in glory. The voyage home was funereal. Messages arrived daily. Totila had taken this city, destroyed that fortress, executed those Romans who had supported Belisarius. Italy was dying, and its greatest defender was sailing away under guard, technically free but practically prisoner. Antonina, in a moment of unexpected honesty, asked, "Do you regret not taking the crown when the Goths offered it?" Belisarius considered before answering, "I regret that loyalty is rewarded with suspicion, that success is punished more than failure, that I served an empire that fears its defenders more than its enemies." It was the closest he ever came to admitting that his loyalty to Justinian had been misplaced. Constantinople's walls appeared on April 15th, 547, grey stone under grey skies, appropriate weather for a grey ending. The city that had once cheered him now barely noticed his arrival. The plague had returned, weaker but still deadly. The blues and greens were fighting again. The economy was collapsing from financing wars that gained territory but no revenue. And in the palace, Justinian waited. Older, sicker, more paranoid, but still emperor, still the spider at the center of an increasingly frayed web. The summons came within hours of landing. Report to the palace, alone, unarmed. The message couldn't have been clearer if it had included an executioner's schedule. Belisarius entered the throne room to find Justinian, surrounded by the Italian treasure he had sent back years ago, now tarnished and dust-covered, monuments to victories that had become defeats. "You lost Italy," the emperor said without preamble. "I never had Italy," Belisarius replied. "I had 4,000 men and commanders authorized to debate rather than obey. I performed miracles with mud." Justinian smiled, the expression of a man enjoying another's pain. "Miracles are your problem, General. You've performed so many that when you merely succeed, it looks like failure. When you actually fail, it looks like betrayal." The sentence was exile without being called exile, poverty without confiscation, disgrace without formal charges. Belisarius was stripped of military command but kept his titles, empty honors for an empty man. His estates were reviewed for tax irregularities, a process that would impoverish him slowly rather than all at once. His veteran soldiers were reassigned to different units, scattered so they couldn't form a power base. He was to live in Constantinople, attending court ceremonies where everyone would see the great general reduced to ceremonial nullity. It was brilliantly cruel, perfectly Byzantine, utterly Justinian. As Belisarius left the palace, a young guard, probably born after the African campaign, asked for his autograph, a piece of papyrus to prove he had met the legendary general. Belisarius signed it with finger that had once directed the conquest of kingdoms, adding a quote from Marcus Aurelius. "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, but do so with all your heart." The guard looked confused. Belisarius clarified, "It means embrace your destruction if you cannot prevent it." He walked home through streets where plague victims were stacked like cordwood, past churches he had enriched with Vandal gold, through forums where his triumphs had been celebrated. The last Roman had returned for the last time. Now all that remained was waiting for the end, which would come with Persian horses, palace conspiracies, and a kind of dignity that even emperors couldn't destroy. The Kutrigur Huns appeared on the horizon in February 559, like a curse made manifest. 20,000 horsemen led by Khan Zabergan, who claimed descent from Attila and had inherited his ancestors' opinion that Constantinople's walls were merely suggestions. Belisarius learned of the invasion not through official channels, but from his gardener, a Thracian refugee who ran into his study, screaming that demons were burning his cousin's farm. The general, now 60, half-blind in his right eye and officially holding no military position whatsoever, sent a message to the palace asking for instructions. The reply came back in Justinian's own hand. "Deal with it. No troops, no authority, no resources. just the expectation that Belisarius would somehow save the empire that had spent 12 years destroying him. The situation in Constantinople was catastrophic beyond farce. The imperial army was scattered across 3 continents, fighting 6 different wars. The city garrison consisted of palace guards who hadn't seen combat since their recruitment, ceremonial units whose armor was designed for parades, not battles, and the Scoli Palatinae, who had evolved from elite warriors into entitled bureaucrats who paid substitutes to stand their watches. When Belisarius arrived at the palace to assess forces, he found the master of soldiers drunk at midday, the arsenal guards playing dice, and the supposed ready reserve consisting of 14 men, 3 of whom were actively dying of syphilis. "How many combat-ready troops do we have?" Belisarius asked the master of soldiers, a nephew of someone important who had never seen blood that wasn't his own. 300 palace guards, if we count the ones with gout, came the reply. "What about the citizens?" Belisarius pressed. The master laughed. "Citizens? They're merchants and lawyers, not soldiers. Half of them would faint at the sight of a Hun." It was then that Belisarius smiled, that dangerous smile his veterans would have recognized, the expression that preceded impossible victories. "Perfect. Zeebergen expects soldiers. We'll give him citizens. He expects strength. We'll give him theater. He expects Belisarius the general. We'll give him Belisarius the magician." The transformation of Constantinople's soft citizens into the illusion of an army was Belisarius's final masterpiece. He had the city's theatrical guilds create 2,000 sets of armor from painted leather and polished tin, costume pieces that looked magnificent from a distance but wouldn't stop a butter knife. The racing factions, blues and greens who normally murdered each other, were unified by shared terror and given wooden spears with metal tips that glinted convincingly in sunlight. Most brilliantly, he recruited the city's prostitutes, actresses, and dancing girls, women who understood performance, dressed them as cavalry, and had them ride back and forth on the city walls where Hun scouts could count them, multiplying his apparent forces by having the same people appear as different units. The psychological preparation was even more elaborate. Belisarius had the city's alchemists create smoke bombs that produced colors never seen in nature, purple fog that smelled of sulfur, green clouds that made horses panic, silver mists that caused temporary blindness. He recruited every musician in Constantinople, from palace virtuosos to tavern drummers, creating a sonic weapon that could project the sound of marching armies where none existed. Most ingeniously, he had mirrors, hundreds of them, gathered from every wealthy household, positioned on the walls to create blinding light displays that suggested supernatural protection. On March 1st, 559, Belisarius led his army out to meet the Huns. 300 actual soldiers, 700 citizens in costume armor, and a theatrical company pretending to be Byzantine high command. His secretary Procopius, long since retired but unable to resist witnessing what would surely be his general's final performance, recorded the scene. It was magnificent and ridiculous, tragic and comic, the empire's greatest general leading hairdressers and hemp sellers against the descendants of Attila. The Huns, expecting easy prey, found instead something inexplicable, an army that moved wrong, sounded wrong, looked wrong, but radiated supreme confidence. The first contact at Melanthius was less battle than hallucination. Belisarius had positioned his forces in a valley where morning mist created natural concealment. As the Huns approached, his musicians began, not war drums but discordant harmonies that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, sounds that made veteran warriors' skin crawl. Then came the smoke, purple, green, silver, billowing clouds that transformed Byzantine costume armor into demonic apparitions. The Hun horses, already nervous from the unnatural sounds, began refusing commands. When Belisarius finally attacked, it wasn't with his fake army, but with his 300 real soldiers, striking from an unexpected direction while the Huns were disoriented by theatrical effects. Zaburgan, no fool despite his barbaric reputation, recognized manipulation when he saw it. But recognition and counter were different things. Every time his scouts reported Byzantine positions, those positions were empty when troops arrived. Belisarius was moving his fake units faster than real armies could travel, creating an impossible omnipresence. When Huns tried to forage, they found wells poisoned with hallucinogens that made water taste like blood. When they made camp, phantom cavalry charges would materialize from smokescreens, kill a few sentries, and vanish before response was possible. The Huns weren't being defeated, they were being driven insane. The climax came at the walls of Anastasius, the outer defensive line 30 miles from Constantinople. Zaburgan, determined to force a real battle, brought his entire force against what his scouts swore was the main Byzantine army. What he found was Belisarius with 200 men, 50 of them actual soldiers, the rest actors trained to die convincingly. The battle was choreographed like a passion play, Byzantine soldiers falling dramatically, crying out in perfect Greek about their noble deaths, while hidden musicians created the cacophony of a massive engagement. But behind the performance, Belisarius's real soldiers were methodically killing Hun leaders with crossbow bolts, each death looking random but actually precisely planned to eliminate command structure. The moment of victory came not through combat, but through pure psychological manipulation. Belisarius had a captured Hun, driven half-mad by hallucinogens, released back to Zaburgan with a message. The emperor has recalled the armies from Italy, Africa, and Persia. 40,000 veterans arrive tomorrow. You can face them, or you can leave with the gold Constantinople offers for peace. There were no armies coming. Italy was in flames, Africa in revolt, Persia pressing borders. But Zaburgan, seeing Byzantine armies everywhere, hearing impossible sounds, fighting enemies that might be human or demonic, chose gold over glory. He withdrew toward the Danube, harassed by phantom forces that existed only in terrorized imagination. Constantinople celebrated Belisarius as savior, the old general who had defeated 20,000 with smoke and mirrors. Citizens who had cowered behind walls now claimed participation in the great victory. The Senate, which had been packing to flee, voted him honors they knew Justinian would never grant. For 3 days, Belisarius was again the city's hero, carried through streets by crowds who forgot they had watched his disgrace in silence. But the emperor's response was silence. No thanks, no acknowledgement, just a summons to return the theatrical armor to the palace warehouses and a bill for the smoke materials. The real blow came from an unexpected source. Sergius, a palace eunuch who had risen through spectacular sycophancy, approached Belisarius with a proposition. The emperor is dying. The plague weakened him. Age finishes him. When he goes, the throne is open. You have the city's love, the army's respect even in retirement. One word from you, and the purple is yours. It was the same offer made by Goths, by Persians, by his own officers throughout decades of service. Belisarius's response never varied. I am the emperor's servant, but Sergius smiled. That's what I hoped you'd say. The emperor will be pleased to know you remain loyal despite temptation. It had been a test, perhaps the 100th, and Belisarius had passed again. But passing tests wasn't enough anymore. In November 562, the accusation came. Conspiracy against the emperor, the charge that had been hovering over Belisarius for 20 years finally landing. The evidence was pathetic. A drunk veteran had claimed in a tavern that Belisarius would make a better emperor than Justinian. Someone reported it, and suddenly the general who had refused 3 crowns was accused of coveting one. The trial was Kafkaesque. No specific conspiracy identified, no co-conspirators named, just vague assertions that Belisarius must have been planning something because no one could be that successful without ulterior motives. The verdict was predetermined, but the sentence surprisingly lenient: house arrest, not execution. Justinian, perhaps remembering that Belisarius had saved his throne 3 times, perhaps simply enjoying the slow torture more than quick death, confined his greatest general to his palace. Guards were posted, visitors restricted, movements monitored. The fortune Belisarius had accumulated through victories was confiscated pending investigation. The man who had conquered kingdoms was reduced to asking permission to walk in his own garden. Antonina, against all expectation, stayed. The woman who had betrayed him throughout their marriage became his fierce defender in disgrace. She petitioned Justinian daily, reminding him of African gold, Italian conquests, Persian defeats. She organized former soldiers to stand vigil outside the palace, silent testimony to their general's service. Most remarkably, she sold her jewels, gifts from various lovers, to pay for Belisarius's defense, though everyone knew no defense would matter. When asked why she suddenly cared, her answer was typically complex. "I wronged him when he was strong. The least I can do is support him when he's broken." The partial rehabilitation came in 563, as suddenly and inexplicably as the accusation. Justinian, perhaps feeling mortality approaching, perhaps simply bored with his cruelty, restored Belisarius's titles and some of his property. The general was allowed to attend court again, standing among other ceremonial figures while real decisions were made by younger men who had never seen a battlefield. He stood silent through discussions of military strategy by people who couldn't find Carthage on a map, listened to plans for reconquering Italy by commanders who didn't know Goths from Vandals, watched the empire he had expanded contract through incompetence and indifference. The last recorded public appearance of Belisarius was at the dedication of a church he had funded with Vandal gold 30 years earlier. Asked to speak, he quoted Homer, not about glory or victory, but Priam's words about watching sons die. "I have seen what no man should see, survived what should have killed me, and remained loyal to those who deserved none." The crowd expected more, but he simply stepped down, the last Roman making his last statement, not about his triumphs, but about the price of serving ingratitude. The legend says Belisarius ended as a blind beggar on Constantinople's streets, crying, "Give an obol to Belisarius who conquered Africa and Italy but was betrayed by envy." Historians dispute this. He retained enough wealth for comfortable retirement, and his partial blindness wasn't total. But the legend captures a truth deeper than fact. The empire's greatest general, who had refused crowns and saved civilizations, was reduced to historical footnote by an emperor who feared greatness in others. Whether he begged on streets or simply faded in comfortable obscurity, the end was the same. The last Roman died as he had lived, loyal to an empire that deserved better than its rulers, serving ideals that his masters had forgotten, holding walls that would soon fall to barbarians, lacking his genius but exceeding his resources. The accusation arrived on December 5th, 562, delivered by 7 palace guards who seemed embarrassed to be arresting a man who could barely see them. The charge was magnificently vague. Participation in efforts potentially contrary to imperial stability. When Belisarius asked for specifics, the guard captain, a boy young enough to be his grandson, stammered, "The specifics are specific to those who need to know them specifically." It was Byzantine bureaucracy at its most Byzantine, a crime so secret that even naming it might constitute treason. Belisarius offered his wrists for chains. The captain looked horrified. "No, Excellence, you're to come voluntarily. The Emperor insists this is merely an inquiry." Everyone knew that imperial inquiries had a peculiar habit of ending in executions. The conspiracy centered around a man named Sergius, not the eunuch who had tested Belisarius earlier, but a different Sergius because Byzantine politics had a shortage of imagination when it came to names. This Sergius, a minor functionary in the grain administration, had gotten drunk at a wedding and declared that certain generals would rule better than certain emperors. When pressed under torture, the standard method of clarification in Byzantine jurisprudence, he added details that grew more elaborate with each broken finger. Belisarius was planning to seize the palace. Belisarius had contacted Gothic allies. Belisarius could command demons. A detail added after the fourth finger when delirium set in. By the time Sergius died of his interrogation, the conspiracy had grown to include half the Senate, several ghosts, and possibly the Archangel Michael. The trial venue was carefully chosen for maximum humiliation, the same hall where Belisarius had received his triumph after conquering Africa. The golden mosaics depicting his victories now watched him stand accused. Justinian, 82 and looking like death negotiating with itself, presided from a throne elevated so high that conversation required shouting, a theatrical touch that made defense sound like desperation. The prosecutor was Paul the Silentiary, nicknamed for his ability to destroy lives while speaking in whispers. His opening statement was a masterpiece of insinuation. "We do not say Belisarius conspired. We merely note that conspiracy existed. Belisarius existed, and existence implies possibility of connection." The evidence was presented with solemn absurdity. Exhibit 1. Belisarius had been seen talking to former soldiers, clearly recruiting for rebellion. The fact that these were invalids begging for alms was deemed irrelevant. Exhibit 2. He had purchased extra grain during the Hun crisis, obviously stockpiling for siege. That he had distributed it free to citizens was cunning generosity designed to win popular support. Exhibit 3. The most damning. He had been heard saying, "The Empire deserves better." Paul the Silentiary let that statement hang in the air like a visible noose. "Better than what?" he whispered. "Better than whom?" Belisarius's defense was hampered by the fact that he wasn't actually allowed to speak. Byzantine law considered the accused too emotionally involved to be objective about their own guilt. Instead, his advocate was Marcellus, a lawyer who had never won a case but was the only one willing to defend someone Justinian wanted condemned. Marcellus's strategy was novel. He argued that Belisarius was too old, too blind, and too tired to conspire effectively. "Look at him," Marcellus pleaded, gesturing at the half-blind 62-year-old general. "He can barely conspire to find his own chamber pot at night. How could he overthrow an empire?" The testimony of witnesses was theater of the absurd. A fishmonger claimed Belisarius had bought mackerel suspiciously. An astrologer swore the stars revealed treasonous intent in the general's birth chart. Most damaging was Isaac the Armenian, once Belisarius's trusted captain, who testified that the general had said after conquering Ravenna, "I could have been emperor." When asked when this statement was made, Isaac admitted it was 23 years ago. When asked why he was only reporting it now, he said his conscience had finally overcome his loyalty. Though the bag of gold he received for testifying suggested conscience had a specific price. Then came the surprise witness, Antonina. She entered dressed in black silk that cost more than most houses, still beautiful at 70 in the way that expensive preservation allows. The court expected her to defend her husband. Instead, she began, "My husband is guilty." The hall fell silent except for Belisarius's sharp intake of breath. "He is guilty," she continued, "of excessive loyalty to an emperor who rewards service with suspicion. Guilty of refusing 3 separate offers of legitimate crowns. guilty of saving this empire so many times that saving it once more makes him suspect. She turned to Justinian. If refusing power is conspiracy, then execute him. But know that you execute the only man in this room who never wanted your throne. Justinian's response was to order a recess, during which the court could hear him raging in his chambers. Not words, just sounds of frustration that suggested even he recognized the absurdity. When proceedings resumed, he had reached a solution that was perfectly Byzantine. Belisarius was guilty, but not guilty. The conspiracy existed, but didn't. The general would be punished for crimes not committed, but potentially contemplated. The formal verdict, read by Paul the Silentiary in his poisonous whisper, was a masterpiece of contradiction. Belisarius is found innocent of active conspiracy, but guilty of creating circumstances wherein conspiracy might be assumed by others to be possible. The sentence was humiliation disguised as mercy. Belisarius's remaining property was confiscated temporarily, a Byzantine temporary that meant forever. His titles remained but were declared ceremonial only, meaning he could call himself general but command no one, not even his own servants. His movements were restricted to his palace and a single church. He could pray but not plot. Most cruelly, his military records were to be revised for accuracy, with court historians rewriting his victories to emphasize Justinian's strategic genius rather than Belisarius's tactical brilliance. The public reaction was muted but meaningful. Veterans gathered outside Belisarius's palace, standing silent vigil in armor they hadn't worn since Italy. Citizens left food at his gates, bread and salt, the traditional offering for prisoners. The blue and green factions, agreeing on nothing else, both sang songs about the general who won everything but justice. Even Gothic merchants, selling goods in Constantinople's markets, wore black ribbons for the Roman who fought honestly. Justinian, watching from his palace, saw not sympathy but potential rebellion. He ordered the vigils dispersed, the songs banned, the ribbons confiscated. Byzantium would mourn its hero in silence or not at all. The aftermath was a slow dissolve into irrelevance. Belisarius spent his days dictating memoirs to a secretary who everyone knew was a spy, carefully editing his own history to avoid anything resembling criticism of Justinian. He received visitors on Tuesdays, old soldiers mostly, coming to reminisce about battles that court historians were busy erasing. His partial blindness worsened, though whether from age or the stress of watching his life's work being dismantled was unclear. Physicians prescribed various treatments, all expensive, none effective. Antonina paid for them by selling property that technically no longer belonged to them, navigating Byzantine law with the same creativity she had once applied to adultery. The strangest episode came in April 563, when a group of Gothic nobles, passing through Constantinople on diplomatic business, requested an audience with Belisarius. Justinian, suspicious but curious, allowed it under heavy guard. The Goths, sons of men Belisarius had defeated, came not for revenge but for education. They wanted to hear from the general himself how he had conquered their fathers with armies smaller than their bodyguards. Belisarius, speaking slowly through failing eyesight, gave them a 3-hour masterclass in warfare. Not the movements of troops, but the movement of minds. How to make enemies defeat themselves through their own expectations. The Gothic Prince Taya, taking notes, allegedly said, "We came to meet a legend. We leave understanding why we lost." Letters arrived from across the empire, carefully worded to avoid suggesting support that might be construed as conspiracy. Mundus wrote from Africa about remembered victories. Germanus sent greetings from Syria, mentioning the Persian campaigns that saved everything. Even Totila, the Gothic king who had retaken Italy, sent a message through merchants. "Your enemy honors you more than your emperor." Belisarius burned them all, knowing that keeping correspondence from successful men would be evidence of networking, which would be evidence of ambition, which would be evidence of treason in the Byzantine calculation, where loyalty plus competence equaled threat. The final insult came in September 563, when Justinian, perhaps feeling mortality's approach, decided to forgive Belisarius. The ceremony was public, humiliating, and mandatory. Belisarius, now barely able to see the throne, was made to prostrate himself, while Justinian, from his impossible height, declared, "We forgive our servant his ambitions, real or imagined. We restore his dignity, such as remains. We acknowledge his services, such as they were." The court applauded on cue. Belisarius rose with difficulty. His knees, like his eyes, were failing, and responded with the only words that could save and damn him simultaneously. "I thank Caesar for justice. I never sought for crimes I never committed in service I never regretted." Walking home from this final humiliation, guided by Antonina through streets he could no longer clearly see, Belisarius encountered a beggar who called out, "Spare a coin for a soldier who served under you in Africa." Belisarius stopped, reached for his purse, then remembered he no longer carried money. Officially restored, but practically penniless. Antonina gave the man gold, and Belisarius asked, "Do you regret serving?" The beggar laughed. "Excellence, I lost an eye at Carthage, a hand at Rome, and a leg to Persian arrows. But I'd lose them all again to say I served under Belisarius." The general stood silent for a long moment, then said, "You paid too much for too little." The beggar's response carried through the street. "You gave too much for nothing at all." Back in his palace, Belisarius found Procopius waiting, his old secretary, now court historian, come to show him the revised history of his campaigns. Africa had been conquered by Justinian's strategic vision. Rome held through imperial wisdom conveyed through subordinate commanders. Persia defeated by divine providence working through Christ's vice-regent on earth. Belisarius' name appeared, but as instrument, not actor, a sword wielded by imperial hand rather than the hand that wielded the sword. "Is any of it true?" Belisarius asked. Procopius, who would later write a secret history telling the actual truth, replied carefully, "Truth is what power says it is. You had power over battles. He has power over history." Belisarius signed his approval of the revision without reading it, his signature shaky but still recognizable. The last official act of the last Roman.
The end began with laughter. On March 13, 565, Belisarius attended what would be his last imperial ceremony, the dedication of a rebuilt section of the Hagia Sophia's dome. Unable to see the magnificent mosaics everyone was praising, he whispered to Antonina, "Describe them to me." She replied loud enough for others to hear. Christ Pantocrator stares down, surrounded by angels. Below him, Justinian offers a model of the church. "You're not depicted, but then, you only conquered the kingdoms that paid for it." A courtier gasped at the sedition. Belisarius laughed, the first genuine laugh anyone had heard from him in years. "At last," he said, "honesty in the palace. The dome must truly be miraculous." That night, the fever started. Physicians diagnosed it as marsh fever. The Antonina suspected poison, a slow-acting variant that mimicked natural disease, very Byzantine, very final. Belisarius himself seemed unsurprised. 65 years is longer than most generals live, he told the physicians fussing over him. Especially successful ones. The fever would break, then return, each cycle leaving him weaker. During lucid periods, he received visitors, not the powerful, who avoided the dying like contagion, but the forgotten. Veterans missing limbs, widows of soldiers, merchants who remembered when Byzantine armies protected trade rather than taxed it into extinction. Word of his illness spread through Constantinople's underground. Taverns, barracks, brothels, the places where truth lived because power didn't bother listening. Veterans began gathering outside his palace, not the orchestrated vigils of before, but spontaneous assemblies of men who had nowhere else to mourn their youth. They didn't chant or protest, just stood in their old armor, whatever pieces they had kept, creating a living monument to campaigns the official histories were busy erasing. Justinian, receiving reports of these gatherings, demanded they disperse. His prefect's response revealed the empire's paralysis. "Caesar, these men are dying too. Most can barely stand. If we arrest them, we'll be arresting corpses by morning." The deathbed became a confessional for the empire's conscience. John the Cappadocian, the corrupt financial minister Belisarius had once exposed, came seeking forgiveness for embezzlement that had crippled military supplies. Belisarius, barely conscious, murmured, "I forgive nothing. God forgives everything. Choose your judge." Bessus, who had sold grain to starving Romans during the Gothic siege, wept at the bedside until Antonina had him removed. Even Narses came, the eunuch rival who had undermined him in Italy, now himself preparing to return there as supreme commander. "Any advice?" Narses asked. Belisarius's response was prophetic. "Don't win too much. In this empire, victory is the only unforgivable sin." On the night of March 19th, Belisarius experienced what witnesses called either divine vision or fevered hallucination. He sat upright, blind eyes seeing something beyond the room, and began issuing battle orders, not randomly, but with tactical precision. "Hold the left wing, the Persians always fate right. Greek fire in the third hour, when the wind shifts. Tell the Goths we accept their surrender, then attack at dawn." For 3 hours, he refought every major battle of his career, correcting mistakes, improving tactics, winning even more completely in delirium than he had in reality. Procopius, summoned to record what might be final words, instead documented a military genius whose mind, even dissolving in fever, operated at levels ordinary commanders couldn't achieve healthy. Justinian's last communication with his greatest general was characteristic, a letter arriving March 20th granting full restoration of titles and property in recognition of adequate service. The timing was perfect Byzantine cruelty, forgiveness arriving just as the forgiven passed beyond caring. Antonina read it to her husband, who smiled with cracked lips. "He forgives me for saving his empire. How generous." Then, with the black humor that had sustained him through impossible campaigns, "Quick, have scribes record this. I want history to know I died wealthy. It will confuse economists for centuries." The final visitors were unexpected, a delegation of Gothic warriors, technically enemies, who had bribed guards for admission. Their leader, a scarred veteran named Witiges, nephew of the king Belisarius had deposed, knelt beside the deathbed and spoke in Gothic, which Belisarius had learned decades ago on the Thracian frontier. "You defeated us with honor. Our songs will remember you when Roman histories forget." Belisarius responded in the same language, words that would become Gothic proverb. "Victory teaches nothing, defeat teaches everything. You will outlast us because you learned from loss." The Goths left silver coins on his eyes, payment for the ferryman, but also Gothic tradition for honored enemies. Death came at dawn on March 21st, 565, with theatrical timing. As the sun rose over Constantinople, Belisarius spoke his last coherent words. "I was the last Roman. After me, there are only Byzantines." Whether he meant this as prophecy or insult, none could say. He died holding Antonina's hand, the woman who had betrayed him repeatedly but stayed when everyone else fled, their marriage ending as it began, in mutual incomprehension and stubborn loyalty. The exact moment of death was marked by something witnesses swore was coincidence but felt like providence. An earthquake, minor but noticeable, as if the earth itself acknowledged that something fundamental had shifted. The funeral became a battle between state control and popular sentiment. Justinian ordered a modest ceremony, appropriate to a restored citizen, but Constantinople had different ideas. As the funeral procession moved from Belisarius's palace to the Church of the Holy Apostles, it grew exponentially. Veterans appeared from nowhere, men thought dead for decades, wearing whatever military insignia they still possessed. Gothic merchants closed their shops and joined, wearing black. Persian traders, remembering honorable warfare, walked alongside their traditional enemies. By the time the procession reached the church, it included perhaps 50,000 people, more than had ever attended an imperial coronation. The eulogy, delivered by a young priest who had never met Belisarius but knew his legend, was interrupted by something unprecedented: spontaneous testimony from the crowd. An armless veteran shouted, "He held Rome with 5,000 against 150,000. A merchant called out, "He conquered Africa with coins, not just swords, paying fair prices when he could have simply taken." A woman, perhaps a widow, cried, "He stopped his men from sacking Naples, saving my daughter from violation." For an hour, the church echoed with memories that contradicted official history, truth drowning out propaganda through sheer volume of witness. Justinian, watching from the palace, he didn't attend, claiming illness, understood the danger. A dead hero could become a martyred saint, and saints were harder to control than generals. His solution was typically Byzantine. He would monumentalize Belisarius into abstraction. Statues were commissioned, showing an idealized warrior who looked nothing like the actual man. Coins were minted with his image, but no name, just Victor. Official histories mentioned the general, without specifics, as if Belisarius had become a title rather than a person. The strategy backfired magnificently. Without official narrative, popular legend filled the vacuum with increasingly elaborate tales. Belisarius hadn't just conquered kingdoms, he had fought demons, commanded angels, refused divinity itself out of humility. 8 months later, Justinian followed his general into death, dying November 14, 565, at age 83. His last words, according to court records, were, "Did Belisarius truly forgive me?" No one answered, because no one knew. Forgiveness, like everything else between emperor and general, had been performed rather than felt. The empire Justinian left was exhausted, expanded beyond its ability to defend, bankrupt from wars that conquered territory but not prosperity. Within a generation, everything Belisarius had conquered would be lost. Africa to Arabs, Italy to Lombards, the Balkans to Slavs. The reconquest had been a fever dream of classical restoration in a medieval world. But the legend grew. In Constantinople's taverns, men swore Belisarius hadn't died, but waited in hidden stasis, ready to return when the empire faced its darkest hour, a Byzantine Arthur. Persian histories recorded him as the only Roman worth fearing. Germanic songs celebrated him as the worthiest enemy, the one who proved their strength by his own. Arab chroniclers, conquering Byzantine territories, found populations who remembered not the emperor who taxed them, but the general who had protected them, and wrote of Belisarius the Just as example of what Rome could have been. The secret history of Procopius, hidden for centuries, finally revealed the truth beneath propaganda. The brilliant general, navigating between a paranoid emperor and an unfaithful wife, performing miracles with nothing, loyal to ideals that his masters had abandoned. When it surfaced, historians debated its accuracy, but veterans who had served under Belisarius, ancient men by then, confirmed, it's true, all of it. He was that brilliant, that loyal, that foolish. The paradox of Belisarius: genius serving mediocrity, loyalty to the undeserving, victory achieving nothing, became the epitaph not just for a man, but for an empire. In the end, Belisarius achieved the only immortality that matters: transformation from history into myth. Emperors are remembered, if at all, as names attached to dates. But Belisarius became archetype, the perfect soldier, the loyal servant, the tragic hero, the last Roman. His tactical innovations were studied in military academies from Baghdad to Paris. His campaigns were mapped by Napoleon, analyzed by Clausewitz. debated by generals who commanded armies equipped with weapons he couldn't have imagined, but who faced the same eternal problems: how to win with less, how to serve the unworthy, how to remain human while being weapon. The final irony came centuries later, when Constantinople fell to Ottoman cannons in 1453. As the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, prepared for his final battle, he allegedly invoked not God, not Christ, but Belisarius. If one man could hold Rome against impossible odds, perhaps we can hold Constantinople. They couldn't. The empire that had feared its greatest general more than its enemies died as Belisarius had predicted, not conquered by barbarians, but collapsed from internal rot, having forgotten that strength without wisdom is brutality, but wisdom without strength is mere philosophy. Belisarius had been both. After him, Byzantium had neither. Today, in Istanbul, Constantinople transformed, tourist guides point to unmarked stones and claim, "Here lies Belisarius." They're all wrong and all right. Belisarius is buried everywhere and nowhere, his tomb as disputed as his legacy. But in the Hagia Sophia, now museum, now mosque, now symbol of empires risen and fallen, there's a pillar with scratches that legend claims spell "Belisarius was here" in Latin. Historians say it's medieval graffiti. Believers say it's genuine. The truth doesn't matter. What matters is that 1,500 years after his death, people still look for proof that Belisarius existed, that loyalty unrewarded is still loyalty, that serving unworthy masters with perfect dedication is its own form of nobility. He was the last Roman. After him, there were only Byzantines, Ottomans, Europeans, names for fragments of what had once been whole. In dying precisely when he did, Belisarius avoided seeing his conquests lost, his victories made meaningless, his empire reduced to ceremonial shadow. He died believing Rome could be restored, that service mattered, that loyalty transcended result. He was wrong about everything except being the last of his kind. In that, as in battle, he achieved perfect victory through perfect timing, exiting the stage precisely when the lights dimmed, leaving only legend luminous in the dark.
The empire died slowly, then all at once. In 568, 3 years after Belisarius's death, the Lombards poured into Italy like water through a broken dam, taking in months what had cost the last Roman years to conquer. The Byzantine garrison commanders, men who had learned warfare from scrolls rather than slaughter, sent increasingly desperate messages to Constantinople. "Send us a Belisarius." The new emperor, Justin II, reportedly laughed. "There was only one, and we killed him with suspicion." By 572, Byzantine Italy consisted of a few coastal cities and theoretical claims. The Gothic wars that Belisarius had won were refought by lesser men with worse results, leaving Italy so devastated that the population wouldn't recover to Roman levels for 1,000 years. In 626, when Avars and Persians besieged Constantinople simultaneously, the city's defenders invoked Belisarius's name like a prayer. Priests claimed to see his ghost on the walls, directing artillery fire. Whether mass hallucination or desperate hope, the vision worked. The city held. But the real savior was memory. Belisarius's defensive innovations from the Gothic siege were still carved into stone tablets in the arsenal, his mathematical calculations for ballistas trajectories still used, his notes on smokescreens and psychological warfare still studied. He saved Constantinople from beyond the grave through institutional memory, the only kind of immortality engineers understand. The Arabs found him everywhere they conquered. Taking Syria in 637, they discovered populations who distinguished between the time of Belisarius, when soldiers protected citizens, and the time after, when soldiers became predators. In Alexandria, falling in 641, the library held 7 separate biographies of Belisarius, all contradicting each other, all true in their own way. The Arab general Amr ibn al-As, reading accounts of the African campaign, allegedly said, "This man conquered a kingdom with fewer men than I need to guard my tent. Either the Romans were giants then, or have become mice now." The answer was both. The Persians remembered him differently. In their histories, Belisarius became Belisarius, a demon general who could be in 7 places simultaneously, and whose eyes could see through earth to detect ambushes. Persian mothers scared children with his name. Be good, or Belisarius will recruit you for his ghost army. But Persian military academies studied his campaigns with deadly seriousness, particularly his use of intelligence networks and disinformation. The Sassanid Military Manual, The Stratagems of Rome, devoted 3 chapters to Belisarius alone, more than all other Roman generals combined. When Persia finally fell to Arab conquest in 651, their last military commander allegedly carried notes from Belisarius's Dara campaign, annotations on defeating superior numbers through superior thinking. In the West, transformation was complete. The Franks, who had fought against him, claimed him as ancestor. Their kings invented genealogies connecting themselves to Belisarius, portrayed as a Frankish prince who had served Rome before reclaiming his true heritage. The Spanish Visigoths, who had never faced him, created an entire romance cycle where Don Belisario fought dragons that were clearly metaphors for Byzantine tax collectors. The Anglo-Saxons, receiving garbled accounts through Irish monks, turned him into Belisarius the Bold, who had refused Satan's offer of earthly power, the only way they could understand someone rejecting a crown. The tactical legacy survived everything. In 718, when Leo the Isaurian defended Constantinople against massive Arab siege, he used Belisarius's false army technique, civilians in armor, smokescreens, theatrical deceptions, so effectively that Arab chroniclers reported facing jinn armies that appeared and disappeared like morning mist. The Bulgarian Khan Tervel studied Belisarius's cavalry tactics, adapting them to steppe warfare. Vikings raiding Byzantine territories found military manuals they couldn't read, but whose diagrams clearly showed Belisarius's tactical innovations. Feigned retreats, coordinated attacks from multiple vectors, using terrain as weapon. They called these documents spellbooks of the war wizard. Not entirely wrong, but the strangest legacy emerged in Constantinople itself. By the 9th century, Belisarius had become part of the city's spiritual geography. There was a column where he had supposedly tied his horse. Touching it brought luck in legal matters. A cistern where he had hidden from palace assassins became a shrine for those seeking justice against powerful oppressors. Most remarkably, in the Hagia Sophia, a spot where condensation regularly formed was said to be Belisarius's tears, weeping for the empire's decline. Pilgrims collected this water in vials, believing it could cure blindness, physical and spiritual. The Macedonian dynasty, rising in 867, tried to reclaim Belisarius officially. Emperor Basil I, himself a peasant who rose through military skill, commissioned a new history portraying Belisarius as spiritual ancestor of the new dynasty, loyalty rewarded at last, several centuries late. But the project collapsed when historians couldn't reconcile the official version, Belisarius as happy servant, with popular memory, Belisarius as betrayed hero. The common people had their own histories, transmitted through songs rather than scrolls, where Belisarius always refused the crown, but wore it in dreams, always saved the empire, but died in poverty, always won the battle, but lost the war against an ingratitude. The Crusaders found him in 1097, not physically, but mythologically. When the First Crusade reached Constantinople, they were told of the greatest Christian general, whose tactics against overwhelming odds might help against Saracen armies. The Norman Prince Bohemond studied accounts of Belisarius's campaigns obsessively, particularly the use of speed and deception against superior numbers. After taking Antioch through stratagem rather than strength, Bohemond allegedly declared, "I am Belisarius reborn." He wasn't. He lacked the loyalty, the genius, and the tragedy. But the attempt at resurrection showed how deeply the legend had penetrated Western military consciousness. In 1204, when the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, Latins destroying what they had come to save, looters found in the imperial palace a room that hadn't been opened in centuries. Inside were Belisarius's personal effects, preserved by some long-dead emperor out of guilt or respect. His sword, practical iron, not ceremonial gold, his campaign maps, annotated in his careful hand, and strangest of all, a letter from Justinian never sent, beginning, "My dear friend and greatest enemy." The letter, supposedly confessing the emperor's jealousy and admiration, disappeared during the looting. Historians debate whether it ever existed. But its legend, the unspoken truth between emperor and general, became more powerful than any verified document. The Byzantines themselves, in their final centuries, turned Belisarius into explanation for everything. Why had the empire declined? Because it had destroyed its Belisarius. Why couldn't they reconquer lost territories? They lacked a Belisarius. The name became shorthand for impossible competence, unappreciated virtue, and the empire's self-destructive tendency to fear its saviors. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine the Paleologos, dying on Constantinople's walls in 1453, supposedly shouted, "I am no Belisarius, but I will die like one, loyal to an empire that exists only in memory." The Ottomans, inheriting Constantinople's stones and stories, found Belisarius useful propaganda. Sultan Mehmed II, justifying his conquest, portrayed himself as Belisarius's spiritual successor, a warrior from the frontiers who restored empire through military genius. Ottoman military schools studied his campaigns well into the 19th century. The Janissaries, elite infantry who decided sultans' fates, adopted Belisarius as patron saint of loyal soldiers betrayed by jealous masters, missing the irony that they themselves often betrayed the masters they were supposed to protect. Renaissance Italy rediscovered him through Procopius's Secret History, finally published in 1623. Here was drama surpassing fiction. The brilliant general, the unfaithful wife, the paranoid emperor, the impossible victories, the inevitable betrayal. Painters competed to depict Belisarius begging for bread, though he probably never did. Poets wrote tragedies where he died forgiving Justinian, though he probably didn't. Machiavelli cited him as example of how virtue without power is mere victimhood. Shakespeare, had he known the story, would have recognized every element of perfect tragedy, except Shakespeare's heroes usually deserved their falls. Belisarius's only flaw was flawlessness itself. Napoleon studied him obsessively, keeping Procopius's histories in his campaign tent. Belisarius proved that tactical genius could overcome any strategic disadvantage, he wrote, except the disadvantage of serving inferior masters. After Waterloo, exiled on St. Helena, Napoleon identified with the end more than the beginning. "We were both destroyed by the thrones we sustained." The difference was that Napoleon had seized a crown, while Belisarius had refused 3. One died in exile. The other died at home. History judges which showed greater wisdom. The American Military Academy at West Point added Belisarius to its curriculum in 1843, focusing on his logistical innovations and use of combined arms. Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, whether consciously or not, replicated Belisarius's cavalry tactics, speed, deception, psychological warfare. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's march through Georgia followed Belisarian principles, making war terrible to make it shorter, destroying infrastructure while protecting civilians who cooperated. Both sides claimed Belisarius, neither understood him. He had fought to build, not destroy, to restore, not revolutionize. In the 20th century, he became paradox and paradigm. Military theorists praised his economy of force, achieving maximum results with minimum resources. Political scientists studied him as example of civil-military relations gone wrong. The apolitical general destroyed by political paranoia. Psychologists diagnosed him with everything from Stockholm syndrome to savior complex. Marxists claimed him as victim of imperialism's contradictions. Fascists portrayed him as military genius, constrained by democratic weakness, missing that Byzantium was autocracy perfected. Everyone projected their preoccupations onto a man who had simply wanted to serve. Today, 15 centuries after his death, Belisarius remains impossible and essential. Military colleges from Sandhurst to Beijing study his campaigns. His tactical innovations, mobile defense, strategic deception, asymmetric warfare, read like modern doctrine written in ancient Greek. Special forces operators, fighting outnumbered in hostile territory, unconsciously replicate his methods. Peacekeepers, trying to protect civilians while serving distant governments that don't understand local conditions, face his dilemmas. Every competent general suspected by incompetent leadership is Belisarius. Every soldier loyal to unworthy causes is Belisarius. Every victory that achieves nothing lasting is Belisarian. But the truest legacy lives in Istanbul's streets, where tourist guides still point to unmarked stones claiming Belisarius walked here. They're lying and telling truth simultaneously. He's everywhere and nowhere, like light from a dead star. The illumination remains, though the source is gone. In the Hagia Sophia, now caught between mosque and museum, like Belisarius between loyalty and wisdom, that same condensation still forms. Scientists explain it as temperature differential. Believers know better. The last Roman still weeps for an empire that feared greatness more than defeat, that chose safety over glory, that destroyed its defenders because their strength revealed its weakness. He called himself the last Roman, and he was. After him came Byzantines, Europeans, moderns, fragments, arguing over a corpse that Belisarius had tried to resurrect. He failed, of course. No one can reverse history's flow, but in failing, he achieved the only success that matters, proving that individuals can stand against entropy, that loyalty transcends result, that serving ideals matters more than serving interests. He was the last of something precious, the citizen soldier who fought for civilization rather than country, who served principle rather than power, who remained human while being weapon. In the end, Belisarius won the only war that matters, the one against forgetting. Empires fall, cities burn, even stones crumble. But stories survive. And his story, the impossible general who conquered kingdoms with handfuls, refused crowns from principle, and remained loyal to the disloyal, continues to teach the hardest lesson: that being the last of something noble is better than being the first of something base. He was the last Roman. There will never be another. That's the tragedy. That there was ever one is the miracle.